Hello and welcome to Mythos and Logos. The word barbarian usually brings to mind a very specific image, doesn't it? Fur-clad warriors, crude weapons, mindless destruction. But the men who crossed the North Sea in the 5th century AD carried something far more dangerous than axes. They carried a language that would one day span the globe, laws that would shape democracies, and stories that still echo in our dreams. They were farmers who became kings, pirates who became saints, and pagans who built some of Christianity's most beautiful monuments. They called themselves the Anglo-Saxons, the English people. History knows them as the Anglo-Saxons. Tonight, we will trace their extraordinary transformation from scattered warbands, fleeing poverty in Denmark and Germany, to the creators of England itself. We will stand in Roman ruins as the eagles depart forever, witness the birth of English literature by candlelight in a Northumbrian monastery, and hear the death cry of a civilization at Hastings. This is a story of survival against impossible odds, of learning and faith rising from violence and chaos, and ultimately of how a mongrel nation of immigrants created one of history's most influential cultures. Before we journey back 15 centuries, I'd love your support through a quick like and subscription. These simple gestures genuinely keep me motivated to create more. Thank you for being here. And because I enjoy knowing our community, please share in the comments where you're located and whether it's day or night for you. The clock unwinds slowly, drawing us ever backward toward the dying days of Roman Britain, where in the early 400s AD, the streets of Londinium echo, not with marching legions but with the desperate whispers of abandonment. When Rome's eagles flew away, picture a February morning in 410 AD. Along Hadrian's Wall, the last Roman soldiers are packing their equipment, their breath forming clouds in the bitter northern air. For 360 years, Rome has been Britain's master, its protector, its connection to the wider world. Now, as Gothic armies threaten Rome itself, Emperor Honorius has made a decision that will reshape an island forever. The legions are going home. In the fortress town of Eboracum, modern York, a Romano-British magistrate named Flavius watches the column of soldiers marching south. His grandfather had been a Celtic chieftain who earned Roman citizenship through military service. His father had worn the toga with pride, built his fortune on Roman law and Roman trade. Now Flavius stands in his villa's courtyard, its hypercoursed heating system still warming the mosaic floors, and realizes that everything his family has built over centuries depends on soldiers who will never return. The withdrawal is not sudden, not really. For 20 years, the legions have been bleeding away, recalled to fight Rome's wars on the continent. But there was always hope they might return. Constantine III had taken Britain's remaining troops to Gaul 3 years ago, promising victory and restoration. Instead, he found only death, leaving Britain defenceless. When the cities of Britain sent desperate appeals to Emperor Honorius, begging for protection against Saxon raiders and Scottish tribes pouring over the abandoned walls, his response was brutally simple. The rescript of Honorius, as historians would later name it, told the cities of Britain to look to their own defence. Rome was finished with its most distant province. What does civilization's retreat sound like? In the market squares of Verulamium and Camulodunum, it sounds like the last merchants closing their shops, knowing that no more ships will bring olive oil from Spain or wine from Gaul. In the great bathhouses of Aquae Sulis, modern Bath, it sounds like the lead pipes cracking as the sophisticated heating systems fail without Roman engineers to maintain them. In the countryside, villas, it sounds like the scratch of quills as educated Romano-British landowners write increasingly desperate letters to anyone who might help, their classical Latin growing more corrupted with each generation that passes without Roman schools. The Saxons know Britain is defenceless. For generations, they have raided the eastern coasts, testing Roman defences, learning the rhythms of resistance. The Romans had built a chain of massive stone fortresses along what they called the Saxon shore, from the Wash to the Solent, each one designed to spot approaching raiders and signal for the naval patrols that kept the sea wolves at bay. Now those fortresses stand empty, their signal fires cold, their harbours silted, the wolves are circling, and there are no shepherds left to guard the flock. By 450 AD, the transformation is complete. Gildas, writing a century later, describes cities where grass grows in the streets and wolves den in the ruins of basilicas. The great Roman roads, those stone arteries that carried civilization to every corner of Britain, still exist, but fewer and fewer people remember where they lead or why they were built. Latin learning retreats to scattered monasteries in the Western Hills, the Romano-British, caught between the Scottish tribes pressing from the north, Irish raiders from the west, and Saxon pirates from the east, do something that will echo through history. They make a bargain with the devils they know to fight the devils they fear more. You stand on a Saxon shore. You are Ambrosius, son of a Romano-British nobleman, standing on the chalk cliffs near modern Dover on a grey morning in 449 AD. The wind carries salt spray from the churning sea below, and your woolen cloak, dyed the expensive purple that marks your father's senatorial rank, does little to stop its bite. Behind you, what remains of your father's warriors shift nervously, their mix of Roman armour and British weapons, a perfect symbol of your hybrid world. Your father, the magistrate of Duravernum Cantiocorum, sent you here to witness something unprecedented. Below, in the sheltered bay, 3 ships are approaching, not the familiar Roman galleys with their banks of oars, nor the leather-sailed curraghs of Irish raiders. These are something different, something your nightmares have taught you to fear. Saxon longships, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the waves like knives, their shallow draughts letting them navigate rivers where Roman ships would ground. But today, these Saxons come not as raiders but as invited guests. Your father and the other British leaders, what they're calling the Council of Britain now that Roman government has collapsed, have hired these warriors as foederati and federated troops, the same arrangement Rome once made with barbarian tribes. Give them land, pay them gold, point them at your enemies. It had worked for Rome. At first, you count 40 warriors on each ship, 120 in total. They stand at the rails, and even from this distance, you can see they are giants compared to your people. Fed on meat and milk from childhood, while your people grew lean on bread and vegetables, bred for war in the harsh winters of Denmark and the German coast. Their leader, you've been told, is named Hengist, the stallion, and beside him stands his brother Horsa, the horse. Behind them, their warriors' spears create a forest of ash, wood and iron that sways with the ship's motion. The smell reaches you before they land, carried on the wind. Wet wool, tar from their ships, the rancid butter they use to slick their hair, and underneath it all, something else. The smell of men who have spent weeks at sea, yes, but also something harder to define. The smell of hunger. Not just for food, but for land, for opportunity, for the soft wealth of a Britain that has forgotten how to defend itself. As the first longship grinds onto the shingle beach, you watch Hengist leap into the shallow water. He doesn't wait for the gangplank. The water that would reach your chest barely covers his knees. His hair is the colour of old bone, braided and hanging past his shoulders. His beard is forked, each point tipped with a silver ring. But it's his eyes that hold you, pale as winter sky, taking in everything. The abandoned Roman customs house, the quality of your men's weapons, the fertile fields beyond the cliffs. Eyes that calculate and measure and want. Your interpreter, a merchant who learned the Saxon tongue trading across the North Sea, steps forward to give the formal greeting your father prepared. But Hengist speaks first, in broken but understandable British. He has been learning your language, preparing for this moment. He thanks your father for his generosity, promises his swords against your enemies, speaks of friendship and alliance. All the right words. But you watch his men as they disembark, the way they study the landscape, the way they test the soil with their boots, the way they look at the Romano-British women who have foolishly come to witness this historic moment. You want to scream at your father's counsel. Can't they see what you see? These are not soldiers who will fight and leave. These are farmers with swords, looking for earth to plant their seeds in, both grain and children. They see Britain not as an employer, but as an opportunity. Every abandoned Roman town is a place to build their own halls. Every British warband, weakened by fighting, is one less obstacle to their expansion. That night, in what was once a Roman signal station, you watch the Saxons feast. They have already begun to change the space, hanging their round shields on Roman walls, spreading their bearskins over mosaic floors, depicting Neptune and his dolphins. They sing songs you don't understand, though the interpreter tells you they're about heroes crossing the whale road, about gold-giving kings and loyal thanes. Their voices are deep, rhythmic, hypnotic. This is not the music of your world, with its echoes of Roman hymns and British laments. This is something else, something that belongs to dark forests and rough seas. You leave before dawn, but the image that will haunt you forever is Hengist's son, a boy of perhaps 15 summers, standing at the cliff top as the sun rises. He spreads his arms wide, as if to embrace all of Kent spread before him, and says something in Saxon. The interpreter, riding beside you, translates without being asked. The boy said, "This will do nicely." The adventus, Saxonum, the invitation that becomes an invasion, rarely announces itself as such. Vortigern, the British warlord, whose name might mean supreme leader, or might be merely a title historians mistook for a proper name, thought he was solving a temporary problem with a practical solution. The year was 449 AD, though dates in this age of dying literacy are always uncertain, and Britain was bleeding from a dozen wounds. The Scottish tribes, what the Romans called the Picts, painted blue and screaming death, poured through the gaps in Hadrian's Wall. Irish raiders, the Scotti, who would eventually give Scotland its name, established permanent settlements on the western coasts, and from the east came the perpetual Saxon threat, those sea wolves who had learned every inlet and river mouth during centuries of raiding. Vortigern needed professional warriors, men who fought for gold rather than tribal loyalty, men who could be dismissed when the crisis passed. Hengist arrived at Vortigern's court, probably located in the old Roman town of Canterbury, with gifts and promises. The Saxon chief was no barbarian brute, but a clever diplomat who understood the delicate psychology of employment and dependence. He brought his most disciplined warriors, not the wild young men who might frighten their employers. He demonstrated Saxon battle tactics, the shield wall that could stop a cavalry charge, the Francisca throwing axes that could shatter British shields before the lines even met. He spoke of his people's need for temporary sanctuary, refugees from flooding and warfare in their homeland, grateful for any opportunity to earn their bread through honest military service. The first victories were intoxicating. At a battle whose location is lost to history, Hengist's warriors shattered a Pictish army that had terrorised northern Britain for a generation. The Scottish warriors, accustomed to fighting disorganised British levies, met instead a wall of professional killers who sang as they killed, Evcumsta, whose round shields locked together like dragon scales, whose spears moved in perfect synchronization. The Picts fled, leaving so many blue-painted corpses that the river, witnesses said, ran purple for 3 days. Vortigern rewarded Hengist with land on the Isle of Thanet in Kent, separated from the mainland by the Wonsum Channel, a strip of water that seemed to offer security. If the Saxons proved troublesome, the British leaders reasoned, they could be contained on their island. But Hengist had not crossed the North Sea to live on an island barely larger than his homeland villages. He requested permission to bring more warriors, just a few ships, to better protect Britain, and perhaps their families too, for warriors fight better when they have something to defend. The ships came, but not a few. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written centuries later, but preserving older traditions, speaks of Hengist sending word to his homeland about Britain's fertility and the British weakness. "Come," he said, "and bring everyone. The land is good, the people are weak, and God or the gods have given us this opportunity." They came in their hundreds, then their thousands, not just warriors now, but farmers, craftsmen, women, and children. Entire communities transplanted themselves across the North Sea, bringing their ploughs and their gods, their laws and their languages. Gildas, the British monk, whose De Excidio Britanniae provides our only contemporary British account, writes with a bitter hindsight of a survivor. He calls Hengist and his Saxons wolves admitted into the sheepfold, and describes how complaints about inadequate supplies became demands, how demands became threats, how threats became violence. When Vortigern tried to limit Saxon expansion, Hengist revealed his true strength. The Foederati were no longer employees, but an occupying army that controlled Kent's ports and roads. The breaking point came, tradition says, at a peace conference. Hengist had agreed to negotiate the Saxon withdrawal, or at least a limitation of their settlement. He suggested the British and Saxon leaders meet unarmed as a sign of good faith, each side bringing 300 nobles to witness the agreement. The location was probably near modern Amesbury, on the open plains, where treachery would be impossible to conceal. The Saxons arrived jovial, embracing their British counterparts, sharing drinking horns, laughing at translated jokes. Then Hengist spoke a phrase in Saxon, "Nemit or Saxus," take your knives. The Saxons had concealed long knives in their boots, the original Saxon from which their name derived. In moments, 300 British nobles lay dead or dying, their blood soaking into Salisbury Plain. Vortigern survived, either spared as too valuable a hostage, or, as some sources suggest, because he had married Hengist's daughter Rowena and was considered family. But his authority died with his nobles. The Saxons were no longer employees, or even invaders. They were conquerors. The revolt spread like fire through dry thatch. Saxon warbands struck simultaneously across eastern Britain, coordinated by some signal system historians can only guess at. Roman towns that had survived the economic collapse now faced physical destruction. Verulamium burned so thoroughly that archaeologists find a layer of black ash across the entire site. In Camulodunum, the great temple to Claudius, where British kings had once sworn loyalty to Rome, became a slaughterhouse. The Romano-British, soft from centuries of peace, scattered before warriors who had been raised on stories of conquest and glory. Yet this was not mere destruction. Behind the warbands came the settlers, families who had sold everything for passage to this new land. They avoided the Roman towns, which they saw as alien and perhaps cursed, instead choosing river valleys and forest clearings that reminded them of home. They brought their building techniques, constructing halls of timber and thatch rather than stone and tile. They brought their agriculture, preferring cattle and pigs to the British sheep and goats. Most importantly, they brought their language, the ancestor of the English we speak today, pushing British Latin and Celtic tongues into the mountains and moors. By 500 AD, the transformation of eastern Britain was complete. What had begun as a military contract had become a migration, perhaps the most successful colonization in European history. The adventure, the coming, as the Anglo-Saxons themselves called it, had created a new reality. Britain was becoming England, though that name would not be used for centuries yet. And somewhere in the chaos, a Romano-British warlord named Artorius was beginning to organize resistance, though history would remember him by another name entirely, Blood in the Ruins. Marcus Flavius had inherited more than just his grandfather's villa near Caleva Atrabutum, modern Silchester. He had inherited 3 centuries of Roman civilization, written in stone and memory, in hypercourse channels that warmed winter floors, and in leather-bound scrolls of Virgil that his grandmother had saved from Gaul. The villa sat in a valley blessed by the gods, or God, depending on which of the household's mixed faiths you followed, with a stream for the mill and soil that had made his family wealthy enough to afford the glazed windows that caught the morning sun. On the last morning of his world, Marcus woke to birdsong. It was late spring in 491 AD, or thereabouts, for maintaining the calendar had become difficult without Roman administrators. The wheat stood green in the fields, promising a harvest that would never come. His wife, Claudia, a British woman whose grandfather had earned citizenship in the legions, was teaching their youngest daughter to read using wax tablets in the garden. Their son had taken the hunting dogs into the forest, hoping for deer. The older servants were preparing for the Feast of Beltane, the British spring festival that the household celebrated alongside Roman holidays, a comfortable mixing of traditions that had defined Romano-British life for generations. The smoke appeared first as a smudge on the eastern horizon, easily mistaken for morning mist. But smoke rises differently than mist, with purpose and urgency, and Marcus had seen enough burning in his 43 years to recognize the signature of catastrophe. He sent his fastest rider to investigate, a British boy who knew every path and hollow for 20 miles. The boy never returned, though days later they would find his horse, its saddle dark with dried blood, wandering riderless through the wheat fields. By noon, the refugees began arriving. First came the slaves from neighbouring estates, running because they had nowhere else to go, babbling about warriors with ash, spears and round shields, about halls burning and livestock slaughtered. Then came the free farmers, those who had worked Roman lands for shares, carrying what they could on their backs, their children silent with shock. Finally came those Marcus recognised, fellow villa owners, men who had shared wine and discussed Cicero in better days, now reduced to frightened animals seeking shelter. Old Quintus arrived last, carried on a litter by his remaining slaves, a Frankish throwing axe still buried in his shoulder. Through teeth gritted against pain, he told Marcus what was coming. Not a raid, not the quick strike and retreat they had learned to survive. This was something else. The Saxons were moving like a plague across the land, but behind the warriors came families, wagons, entire communities transplanting themselves into Roman Britain's corpse. They weren't stealing, they were replacing. Marcus had 30 men who could hold weapons, half of them trained, the rest farmers, who knew one end of a spear from the other, only because they used them for hunting. The villa's walls, decorative boundaries meant to mark property rather than stop armies, stood 6 feet high and would perhaps slow attackers for minutes. He could run, take his family west to the British kingdoms that still survived in Wales and Cornwall. But this villa was not just property, it was his family's history written in architecture, their identity carved in stone. His great-grandfather's funeral monument stood in the garden. His children's height marks decorated the doorframe of the triclinium. To flee was to admit that 300 years of civilization meant nothing. They came at dawn, 2 days later, announced by the sound of a war horn that turned Marcus's bowels to water. Not the clear note of a Roman trumpet, but something deeper, more primal. The voice of the dark forests beyond the Rhine that Rome had never conquered. Through the morning mist came shapes that resolved into warriors, perhaps 60 of them, their round shields painted with beasts and serpents, their spears catching the first light. Behind them, just visible, were the wagons and families, the future waiting to occupy the present's grave. The Saxons didn't charge. They didn't need to. Their leader, a man whose blonde beard was plaited with silver rings, approached the villa's gate and spoke in broken Latin. "Surrender," he said. "Take what you can carry, leave, or die. The choice was delivered without malice, the way a farmer might discuss slaughtering livestock. Business, not personal. Marcus stood on his decorative wall, looking at the warriors who waited with patient confidence of men who had done this before, would do it again, until all of Roman Britain was theirs. The villa burned by noon. The Saxons were efficient in their destruction, systematic in their looting. They took the metal, every piece, from lead pipes to bronze decorations. They smashed the statues, not from hatred but to break them down for lime. The hypocaust system, that marvel of Roman engineering, they destroyed simply because they didn't understand it, seeing only useless spaces beneath floors where evil spirits might dwell. The books, 4 generations of collected learning, made excellent kindling. Marcus died trying to save those books, an old man's desperate charge with a rusty gladius that ended with a Saxon spear through his chest. As his vision darkened, he saw his wife and children being loaded onto Saxon wagons, slaves now in a new world that had no place for Roman citizens. The last thing he heard was his 5-year-old granddaughter crying in British, then slowly, haltingly, trying to communicate in the Saxon tongue. She was already beginning to learn. Adaptation, survival, the future, the lost years. Between the last Roman records and the first reliable Anglo-Saxon chronicles lies a gap of nearly 200 years, a silence so profound that historians call it the Dark Ages, not from medieval prejudice, but from simple absence of evidence. Yet absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and in the soil of Britain lies a record written not in words, but in burned timber and broken pottery, in abandoned villas and mass graves, in the changing patterns of agriculture and the shifting boundaries of survival. Consider what archaeology tells us about the scale of transformation. At Wroxeter, the 4th largest city in Roman Britain, excavations reveal a macabre timeline. The Forum, once filled with merchants and magistrates, shows evidence of timber buildings erected inside the stone shells of Roman structures around 450 AD, a desperate attempt to maintain urban life. By 500 AD, these too were abandoned. The Great Bathhouse, an engineering marvel that could accommodate 1,000 bathers, became first a makeshift fortress, then a quarry for building stone, finally a ghost haunted only by wolves and memory. Yet the story is not uniform destruction. At Cadbury Castle in Somerset, which some romantically identify with Camelot, archaeologists find something remarkable. Around 500 AD, someone with resources and vision refortified this ancient hill fort. The new walls incorporated Roman masonry techniques, but followed British defensive traditions. Inside, post holes reveal a great hall that could seat hundreds, built in a style that borrowed from both British and Saxon traditions. Someone was learning from their enemies, adapting, surviving. The legendary Arthur? We cannot say, but someone fought back, someone organised resistance, someone gave the British hope for at least a generation. The pottery tells its own story. Roman pottery, mass-produced on wheels in industrial kilns, disappears almost overnight from archaeological sites. In its place appears handmade Saxon pottery, crude by Roman standards but perfectly functional, decorated with stamps and patterns that speak of different aesthetic values, different ideas about beauty and utility. But examine closely the transitional sites, those places where British and Saxon lived close together, and you find hybrid forms, British potters learning Saxon techniques, Saxon potters incorporating British designs. Even in conquest, even in catastrophe, human creativity finds a way to blend and merge and create something new. Bones speak when documents are silent. At Wasperton in Warwickshire, a cemetery used from Roman times through the Saxon period reveals the biological reality of transformation. The Roman period skeletons show signs of relatively good nutrition, dental care, medical treatment, including healed fractures properly set. The early Saxon burials tell a harsher story of vitamin deficiency, untreated injuries, women dead in childbirth at horrifying rates. But by the 6th century, the skeletons grow taller, stronger, healthier. The Saxons were learning to work British land, or perhaps British survivors were teaching them. Integration, not just invasion. The mystery deepens when we examine place names, those linguistic fossils that preserve ancient realities. Across eastern England, Saxon names dominate. Ham for home, Tun for settlement, Ing for the people of. Birmingham, the home of Beorma's people, Nottingham, the home of Snot's people, thankfully shortened over time, but scattered among them are British names, especially for rivers and forests, those features too fundamental to rename. The Thames, the Severn, the Avon, all Celtic names that Saxon tongues learned to pronounce, and in some places, hybrid names that shouldn't exist, according to our simple narratives of conquest and replacement. Cricklade, combining British crook, meaning hill, with Saxon gelad, meaning river crossing. Someone was talking to someone else, even in the darkest of the Dark Ages. Climate science adds another layer to the mystery. Ice cores from Greenland and tree rings from European oaks reveal that the mid-6th century experienced one of the most severe climate disruptions in recorded history. In 536 AD, a volcanic eruption, probably in Iceland or Indonesia, threw so much ash into the atmosphere that contemporary chronicles describe 18 months without summer. Cassiodorus in Italy wrote of the sun giving no more light than the moon. In Britain, where written records had already failed, the impact would have been catastrophic. Crop failures, famine, plague following weakened populations. The Justinianic plague, which devastated the Mediterranean world in 541 AD, almost certainly reached Britain, though we have no documents to confirm it. This climate catastrophe might explain one of the great mysteries of the Saxon conquest. Why did it take so long? If the British were so weak and the Saxons so strong, why did it require nearly 2 centuries to complete the transformation of Britain into England? Perhaps because nature accomplished what neither British resistance nor Saxon aggression could achieve alone, a clearing of the land that allowed a new society to grow in the ashes of the old. DNA studies of modern British populations provide the latest chapter in unravelling these lost years. The genetic evidence suggests that in many areas, especially in the west and north, the Anglo-Saxon genetic contribution is surprisingly small, perhaps 20 to 40%. The British didn't disappear. They became English. They adopted Saxon language, culture, and identity while retaining their genetic heritage. It's a process seen throughout history, conquered peoples, taking on the identity of their conquerors for survival, advancement, or simply because the old world had died and a new one needed to be born. 7 kingdoms from the ashes. By the year 600 AD, the chaos of invasion and migration had crystallized into something resembling political order. Where once Roman administration had divided Britain into carefully managed provinces, now 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged from the confusion, each with its own dynasty, its own dialect, its own particular blend of Saxon, Angle, and Jutish traditions mixed with whatever British customs survived. The Heptarchy, historians would later call it, though the name suggests more organisation than really existed in an age when borders shifted. With every battle, and kingdoms rose and fell with the lives of individual kings, Kent remained the first, and for a time the most sophisticated of these kingdoms. Its proximity to the continent, maintaining trade connections that brought gold, garnets, and glimpses of the wider world. The kings of Kent claimed descent from Hengist himself, though genealogies in this age were creative affairs, designed to legitimize power rather than record history. At Canterbury, in buildings that mixed Roman stone foundations with Saxon timber superstructures, King Ethelbert held court in something approaching the old style, with laws written down, coins minted with his image, and diplomatic marriages that connected Kent to the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel. North of the Thames, the East Saxons gave their name to Essex, controlling the crucial port of London. Though the great Roman city was largely abandoned, its population huddled in a new settlement called Lundenwic to the west of the old walls. The East Angles dominated modern Norfolk and Suffolk, rich agricultural lands that would make them wealthy enough to bury their king at Sutton Hoo, with treasures that stunned archaeologists 13 centuries later. Here, in the ship burial of King Raedwald, perhaps lay golden belt buckles of Byzantine craftsmanship, silver spoons inscribed with Greek letters, and a helmet whose design descended directly from Roman parade armour, modified by Saxon aesthetics into something magnificent and terrible. The Midlands belonged to Mercia, whose name meant border people, though borders with whom remained deliberately vague. Mercian kings would become the most aggressive of the Saxon rulers, constantly expanding, constantly fighting, viewing the island not as a collection of legitimate kingdoms, but as a prize to be won entirely. Their great work, Offa's Dyke, an earthwork stretching 150 miles along the Welsh border, represents one of the most ambitious construction projects of early medieval Europe. A statement in earth and timber that here civilization ended and their barbarism began, though which side was which depended entirely on your perspective. Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, controlled the rich chalk downlands of southern Britain. Its founders, according to their own chronicles, were Cerdic and his son Cynric, who landed at Southampton Water in 495 AD and fought their way inland. Whether Cerdic was truly Saxon, or perhaps a British leader with a Saxon warband, his name being possibly Celtic, remains one of history's minor mysteries. But his descendants would become the most important dynasty in English history, eventually producing Alfred the Great, and ultimately the royal house that rules Britain today. Northumbria, the land north of the Humber, was actually two kingdoms that struggled and eventually merged, Bernicia and Deira. Here, the fusion of British and Anglian was most pronounced. The great fortress of Bamborough, perched on its coastal crag, had been a British stronghold called Din Gwardi, before becoming the seat of Anglian kings. In Northumbria, British place names survived in greater numbers. British nobility sometimes intermarried with Anglo-Saxon rulers, and British Christianity would maintain traditions distinct from Roman practice long after the conversion. The Seventh Kingdom, Sussex, the land of the South Saxons, remains the most mysterious, isolated by the great forest of the Weald, leaving few records and fewer archaeological traces of its early centuries. Its founder, Ael, appears in early sources as the first Bretwalda, a title meaning either Briton ruler or broad ruler, suggesting some kind of military supremacy over the other kingdoms, though what this meant in practice remains unclear. These kingdoms were not nation-states in any modern sense. They were networks of loyalty centered on warrior kings who distributed gold and glory to their followers. A kingdom's borders extended as far as its king could ride, with his warband to collect tribute and enforce submission. Royal courts were mobile affairs, travelling from estate to estate, consuming the agricultural surplus that represented the real wealth of early medieval England. Laws were remembered rather than written, at least initially, preserved in the memories of law speakers, who could recite the traditional penalties for everything from murder to stealing bees. Yet from this apparent chaos emerged structures that would endure for centuries. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms developed the concept of the shire, an administrative unit that survives in English county names today. They created the Wittenage Mot, the assembly of wise men who advised the king and could, in theory, choose his successor, a distant ancestor of Parliament. They established a system of military obligation, the Fyrd, where free men owed military service in exchange for land, presaging the feudal system that would dominate medieval Europe. Most remarkably, these kingdoms maintained a sense of shared identity despite their constant warfare. They called themselves the Anglo-Saxons, the English people, distinguishing themselves from the Welsh, which meant foreigners in Saxon, though the Welsh were actually the native British. They shared legends of their migration, stories of Hengist and Horsa, of the Great Crossing, of the empty land they claimed to have filled. They recognized each other's nobility, accepting marriage alliances, and fostering arrangements where young princes were raised in rival courts. When Christianity came, it would spread from kingdom to kingdom through these networks, carried by royal women, married into pagan courts, and by young nobles who had learned new ideas in foreign halls. The old gods in new lands. Before the cross cast its shadow across Saxon halls, other gods held sway in English hearts. Woden, the Allfather, one-eyed wanderer who traded his sight for wisdom, gave his name to Wednesday and his blessing to kings. Every Anglo-Saxon royal genealogy traced its line back to him, that divine ancestor who legitimized earthly power. Thunor, whom the Norse would call Thor, thundered across Thursday, his hammer defending Middle-earth from the chaos monsters that threatened to devour creation. Tu, the war god who gave us Tuesday, had once been supreme before Woden's rise, his rune still carved on Saxon swords to bring victory. Frigg, Woden's wife, claimed Friday, goddess of hearth and harvest, of the bonds that held families and communities together. These were not distant, abstract deities contemplated by philosophers, but immediate, present powers who walked the same earth as men, crossing the rainbow bridge between Asgard and Middle-earth when it suited their purposes. Saxon paganism was a religion of sacred groves rather than temples, of springs and stones that marked the thin places where the divine pressed close to the mortal world. Near modern Peterborough stood the sacred oak of Thunor, so vast that 20 men holding hands could not encircle its trunk, where kings swore oaths and justice was dispensed, knowing that the god himself witnessed every word. Picture a Saxon warrior preparing for battle in 600 AD. He does not pray, in our sense of the word, kneeling in submission to beg favour from distant heaven. Instead, he performs actions that bind him to cosmic forces. He touches the boar image on his helmet, invoking Frigg's sacred animal for protection. He drinks from a horn passed hand to hand among his warrior band, the mead mixed with blood from a sacrificed horse, creating literal blood brotherhood that would endure beyond death. He listens as the Scop, the bard, recites genealogies that connect his lord to Woden, making every battle a continuation of divine struggle against chaos. The Saxon universe was not comfortably ordered between heaven and hell, but precariously balanced on Yggdrasil, the world tree whose roots plunged through multiple realities. Below lay Hell's realm, not a place of punishment but of grey continuation, where ordinary dead dwelt in shadowy half-life. Around Middle-earth coiled the world's serpent, whose eventual awakening would bring Ragnarok, the doom of gods and men alike. This was not a cosmos that promised salvation, but one that demanded courage in the face of inevitable destruction. The highest virtue was not faith but honour, not hope but defiance against the dying of the light. Saxon paganism shaped the landscape in ways that endure 15 centuries later. Every feature had potential spiritual significance. Springs were passages to the underworld, which is why even today British folklore speaks of wishing wells and water spirits. Forest clearings marked by ancient stones became thingsteads, assembly places where human law and divine justice intersected. The names survive even when memory fails. Harrow, Weedon, Alcombe, all preserve in their syllables the Old English Herg Weo and Alash, words for pagan holy sites that Christian tongues continue to speak long after the altars were overthrown. The religious calendar followed the agricultural year, binding cosmic mythology to earthly necessity. Mother's Night, the winter solstice, when the sun died and was reborn, required offerings to the ancestral mothers who protected the family line. Eostre's feast at the spring equinox celebrated the goddess of dawn and fertility, whose symbols of eggs and hares Christians would quietly appropriate for Easter. Harvest home, when the last sheaf was cut with ceremony and woven into corn dollies that preserved the field's spirit through winter, continued in British folk tradition into living memory. Yet this was not a monolithic faith with orthodox doctrines. Each kingdom, each village, perhaps each family, maintained its own specific traditions, its own particular relationship with the divine. The Saxons of Sussex might venerate a local spring spirit, unknown in Northumbria. The Angles of Mercia might tell different stories about Woden than those recited in Kent. This flexibility, this lack of central religious authority, would prove both a weakness when confronted by organised Christianity and a strength that allowed pagan practices to slip quietly beneath Christian surfaces, surviving in folk customs, in half-remembered festivals, in the turning of the agricultural year. The weapons speak of this faith as clearly as any written record we lack. Saxon spears carved with runes that were both letters and magical symbols. Swords with names and genealogies, passed from father to son like living beings. The great pattern-welded blades, their steel folded and refolded until serpent patterns emerged in the metal, were not just weapons, but sacred objects that connected the warrior to cosmic forces. To break such a blade was not mere property damage, but spiritual catastrophe, the severing of bonds between earth and sky, present and past, man and God. Twilight over the Celtic West. As Saxon settlements spread like slow frost across lowland Britain, the Romano-British world did not simply vanish, but retreated, transformed, and endured in the highland zones, where geography favoured defence and distance preserved difference. Picture the great exodus of the late 5th century, not as dramatic flight, but as gradual withdrawal, family by family, estate by estate, as the realisation dawned that the old world would not return. They loaded what could be carried onto ox carts and pack horses, carved stones from family shrines, manuscripts wrapped in oiled leather, silver plate buried for 3 generations, and finally unearthed the physical fragments of Romanitas that might preserve identity in exile. In the mountains of Wales, kingdoms emerged that were neither Roman nor Saxon, but something uniquely British, speaking evolved Latin and Brythonic Celtic, maintaining Christianity when the Saxons worshipped Woden, preserving memories of municipal magistrates and provincial governors in the titles of their princes. Gwynedd in the north, Powys in the centre, Dyfed in the south. These were not mere tribal territories, but conscious attempts to maintain civilised governance in an age of dissolution. Their courts produced poetry of extraordinary sophistication, laments not just for the dead but for entire ways of life, swept away by Saxon steel. Listen to the voice of Taliesin, the great bard of the late 6th century, singing in the hall of Urien of Reged, one of the last great British kings to rule in what is now northern England and southern Scotland. His verses, preserved through centuries of manuscript copying, speak of a world balanced on the knife's edge between survival and extinction. He sings of Catterick, where British cavalry charged Saxon shield walls in a battle so catastrophic that of 300 warriors who rode out, only one returned. Yet even in defeat, the poetry insists on British superiority. Cultural, if not military, Christian rather than pagan, civilised against barbarian, holding fast to distinctions that mattered more in the heart than on the battlefield. The transformation was not merely political, but linguistic. Latin, the language of law and literature for 4 centuries, retreated to the monasteries. British Celtic, which had survived Roman rule as the language of the countryside, now became the sole tongue of displaced aristocrats who had once prided themselves on their classical education. Place names tell the story of this retreat. East of a line from Edinburgh to Exeter, British names survive mainly for rivers and hills, those features too fundamental to rename. West of that line, the linguistic landscape remains predominantly Celtic, preserving in syllables and sounds the ghost geography of Roman Britain. In Cornwall, the peninsula that Saxons called West Wales, meaning land of foreigners, though it was they who were foreign, British independence endured until the 9th century. Here, Mediterranean trade connections survived that had been severed elsewhere. Phoenician traders had come for Cornish tin 1,000 years before Rome, and their successors still arrived from Brittany and Iberia, bringing wine and returning with metal that had become even more precious as other sources failed. The Cornish kings maintained contacts with the Eastern Roman Empire, styling themselves with Byzantine titles, minting coins that imitated Constantinople's designs, imagining themselves part of a Roman world that had forgotten they existed. Across the Irish Sea, a different transformation occurred. British refugees, fleeing Saxon expansion, established kingdoms in what is now Brittany, carrying their language and customs to continental Europe. They named their new home Lesser Britain, making their island of origin Greater Britain, Britannia Major, the Great Britain that English tongues still speak today. These maritime connections created a Celtic network spanning from Scotland to Spain, united by language, religion, and shared antipathy towards Saxon expansion. Irish monks travelled to British monasteries. British princes found refuge in Irish courts, creating a cultural exchange that would profoundly influence the eventual conversion of the Anglo-Saxons themselves. The material culture of this British twilight reveals desperate adaptation and stubborn continuity. In the hill fort of South Cadbury, possibly the Camelot of later legend, excavations reveal a great hall built around 500 AD, using Roman architectural knowledge, but Celtic construction techniques. Mortared stone foundations support timber superstructures. Roman roof tiles are reused, but in British patterns. The pottery is wheel-thrown, maintaining Roman techniques, but decorated with Celtic spirals and animal designs that would have horrified classical aesthetes. This is not the crude work of barbarians, but the conscious choice of people creating a new identity from fragments of the old. Christianity provided the strongest thread of continuity. While Saxons sacrificed to Woden in sacred groves, British Christians maintained the liturgy in stone churches that, if humbler than their Roman predecessors, still represented architectural ambition beyond anything in Saxon lands. At Llantwit Major in Wales, a monastery founded around 500 AD became a centre of learning that preserved not just Christian texts but classical literature, mathematical knowledge, and astronomical observations. Students came from Ireland, Brittany, even Gaul, creating an international scholarly network that operated entirely independent of Saxon England. Yet isolation bred divergence. Cut off from Rome by Saxon conquest and Frankish expansion, British Christianity developed its own practices. They calculated Easter differently, causing bitter disputes with Roman missionaries. Their monks wore their tonsure, the ritual haircut, marking religious devotion from ear to ear across the crown, rather than the Roman circular style. These seem trivial differences, but in an age when religious unity meant political legitimacy, they marked the British as schismatic, heterodox, dangerous to the Orthodox faith that would soon arrive from Rome to reclaim the island for Catholic Christianity. The Augustine mission, in the Great Basilica of St. Peter, in Rome, where Constantine had built Christianity's greatest monument over the Apostles' grave, Pope Gregory gazed upon 3 boys in the slave market of the Roman Forum. The year was approximately 590 AD, and these were Angles from Dara in northern Britain, captured in some frontier raid and brought to Rome's markets where exotic slaves commanded premium prices. Their skin was pale as moonlight, their hair like spun gold, features so unlike the dark Mediterranean norm that they seemed almost otherworldly. When Gregory asked what nation produced such beings, he was told they were Angles, not Angles but angels. He supposedly replied, "And they shall be saved from the wrath of God, and called to the mercy of Christ." 7 years later, now Pope Gregory the Great, he remembered those angelic slaves. Britain, that lost province, where Christianity had once flourished under Roman rule, had fallen into pagan darkness. Reports reached Rome of Saxon kings who sacrificed horses to false gods, of British Christians who celebrated Easter on the wrong date and cut their hair in heretical fashion, of a spiritual wilderness where once bishops had debated theology in Latin. Gregory, who had wanted to undertake the mission himself before being elected pope, selected instead Augustine, prior of St. Andrew's Monastery on Rome's Caelian Hill. Augustine was not the bold missionary of later hagiography, but a careful Roman administrator who understood that converting kings meant converting kingdoms. With 40 companions, he departed Rome in 596 AD, carrying ivory tablets with papal instructions, silver chalices for mass, illuminated gospels bound in gold, and most importantly, letters of introduction to Frankish bishops and nobles who might smooth their passage. When they reached southern Gaul and heard tales of Saxon ferocity, of kings who drank from the skulls of enemies, and priests who read the future in horse entrails, Augustine's companions wanted to turn back. Augustine himself returned to Rome to beg release from this terrifying mission. Gregory sent him back with letters, granting him archiepiscopal authority and stern reminders that God's work permitted no cowardice. They landed on the Isle of Thanet in Kent in 597 AD, the same island where Hengist had first established Saxon power 150 years before. But much had changed. King Ethelbert of Kent had married Bertha, a Frankish Christian princess who had brought her own bishop and maintained a small church in Canterbury dedicated to St. Martin. For years, she had prepared her husband's heart, speaking of Christ's mercy and power, of the Frankish kings who ruled by God's grace, of the advantages, spiritual and political, of joining the community of Christian kingdoms. Ethelbert received the missionaries outdoors, beneath an ancient oak, fearing that Christian magic might work more powerfully within walls. Augustine approached in procession, his monks singing litanies in Latin, carrying a silver cross and a painted icon of Christ that seemed to follow viewers with its eyes. Through interpreters, for Augustine spoke no English and Ethelbert no Latin, the prior delivered a message that had been crafted as carefully as any diplomatic treaty. He spoke not of damnation but of eternal life, not of destroying Saxon culture but of perfecting it, not of submission to Rome but of membership in a universal brotherhood of kings. The king's response was cautiously pragmatic. He would not abandon the gods of his fathers on the word of strangers, but neither would he prevent them from preaching to any who wished to listen. He granted them residence in Canterbury, provision from the royal estates, and permission to restore the old Roman church that Bertha had been using. More importantly, he allowed them to demonstrate their God's power through Roman medicine, architectural knowledge, and literacy, practical magic that spoke louder than sermons. Within a year, Ethelbert accepted baptism, though the exact date remains disputed, somewhere between 597 and 601 AD. His conversion was not the dramatic road to Damascus transformation of Paul, but a careful political calculation dressed in spiritual clothes. As a Christian king, he could correspond with Frankish rulers as an equal. His laws could be written down in the Roman fashion, giving them permanence beyond memory. His kingdom could participate in the continental trade networks that Christianity facilitated. Most practically, the British populations in his kingdom, still numerous despite Saxon dominance, would more readily accept his rule if he shared their faith. The conversion of a kingdom happened not in mass baptisms but in countless individual decisions. A Saxon noble accepted baptism because his king had, maintaining loyalty above theology. A British slave rejoiced that his masters now worshipped his God, though the Saxon Christ who led warriors to victory seemed different from the suffering servant he had known. A Saxon bride agreed to Christian marriage because it offered protections unknown in pagan law, where divorce required only a husband's declaration. A young warrior converted because the monastery offered education, literacy, and advancement through learning rather than just through battle. Augustine established his archiepiscopal seat at Canterbury, building on Roman foundations both literal and metaphorical. The new cathedral rose where Roman buildings had stood, using salvaged stone and maintaining classical proportions that must have seemed miraculous to Saxons accustomed to timber halls. He created a school where Saxon nobles' sons learned Latin alongside British slaves who already spoke it, beginning the fusion of cultures that would define English Christianity. By 604 AD, when Augustine died, worn out by the effort of building a church from ruins, Christianity had spread to London and Rochester, and negotiations were underway with other Saxon kingdoms. Yet this was not simply Roman victory over Saxon paganism. The Christianity that emerged was distinctly English, maintaining practices that would have horrified Gregory. Sacred wells, once dedicated to water spirits, were rededicated to saints, but continued to receive offerings. The feast of Eostre became Easter, keeping its eggs and hares. Churches were built on pagan sacred sites, inheriting their spiritual power. Saxon aristocratic culture, with its emphasis on loyalty, generosity, and martial valor, transformed Christ into a warrior king, leading his thanes to victory over death. The Dream of the Rood, the great Anglo-Saxon poem, would later describe the crucifixion as Christ's heroic battle, mounting the cross like a warrior mounting his horse, eager for combat. You kneel in a timber church. You are Osric, thane to King Edwin of Northumbria, and this morning in 627, AD will change everything you thought you knew about gods and men. The church at York is nothing like the great stone temples you've heard the Romans built. It's a modest timber structure, hastily constructed over the past months, its walls still weeping resin, its floor strewn with fresh rushes that cannot quite mask the smell of damp earth. Through gaps in the planking, Easter morning light creates bars of gold and shadow, and your breath mists in the chill air as you kneel on the hard ground, your warrior's knees protesting this unaccustomed posture. Around you kneel the great men of Northumbria, warriors who have stood with you in the shield wall, their sword hands now clasped in prayer, a gesture Bishop Paulinus taught you that feels as foreign as speaking Latin. Your wife kneels beside you, 7 months pregnant, with what you pray will be a son, though you're no longer certain which God receives that prayer. She has wanted this conversion since Queen Ethelberga arrived from Kent with her Christian retinue, bringing stories of eternal life and resurrection that made the women weep with hope. The bishop stands before the altar, a simple table covered with white cloth that somehow seems more sacred than the blood-soaked altars where you've watched horses sacrificed to Woden. Paulinus is a tall man, dark as a Welshman, with eyes that burn with certainty you've never seen in the eyes of pagan priests who read omens in bird flight and speak always of fate and doom. He raises a cup of silver that catches the light, speaking words in Latin that flow like water over stones. Incomprehensible but beautiful, carrying meaning beyond language. You think of last night's feast, when King Edwin asked his counsellors about this new faith. Old Coifi, the chief pagan priest, had shocked everyone by speaking first for conversion. The old gods, he said, had given him nothing despite years of faithful service, while this Christ offered eternal rewards. But it was the words of an unnamed noble that echo in your mind now. He said human life was like a sparrow flying through a mead hall in winter, coming from darkness through a brief moment of warmth and light, then vanishing back into darkness. If this new faith could tell what came before and after that flight, shouldn't we listen? The water is colder than you expected when Paulinus pours it over your head, speaking your name and words about Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It runs down your face, soaking into your best tunic, the one with gold thread at the collar that marks your status. Your hand instinctively reaches for Thor's hammer that has hung around your neck since childhood, finding only empty space. You burned it last night with your other pagan amulets, watching the silver melt and run while something twisted in your chest. Grief or relief, you couldn't say. As you rise from your knees, you feel different, though you cannot name the change. The world looks the same through the church doorway, the same Yorkshire hills rolling toward the same horizon. But something has shifted in how you see it. This morning you woke as Osric, Thane of Edwin, descendant of Woden, bound by oaths of blood and gold, to fight and die for your lord. You rise as Osric the Christian, still Edwin's Thane, but now also something called a child of God, part of what Paulinus calls the universal church that stretches from Ireland to Jerusalem. Your 8-year-old son waits outside with the other children, too young for baptism until they can understand the creed. He looks at you with confused eyes, wondering if you're still his father now that you serve a different God. You want to tell him that nothing has changed, but that would be a lie. Everything has changed. The sacred grove where you made your first warrior's oath is now just trees. The harvest festivals that marked the year's turning must find new meanings. Even death has changed. No longer a grey journey to hell's dim halls, but a promise of something Paulinus calls paradise, though his descriptions of endless singing seem less appealing than Valhalla's eternal battle and feast. Walking from the church into Easter morning, you see other Saxons emerging from the water, hair dripping, faces wondering. Some look relieved, as if a burden has lifted. Others seem lost, cut loose from ancestral moorings. The British slaves watching from a distance have expressions you cannot read. Joy, perhaps, that their masters now share their faith, or anger that the God who failed to protect them from Saxon swords now embraces Saxon souls. Tonight there will be a feast, but not like the wild celebrations after battle victories. Paulinus says Christians feast differently, with gratitude rather than boasting, sharing bread and wine that somehow becomes sacred through blessing. You will sit in the same hall, with the same companions, but the songs will be different. The Scop is learning biblical stories to weave into his word hoard, though David killing Goliath sounds suspiciously like Thor fighting giants when he tells it. You wonder what your grandfather would think, he who died holding his sword so he might enter Valhalla as a warrior. But perhaps this Christ God accepts warriors too. Paulinus speaks of spiritual warfare, of faith as a shield, and righteousness as armour. Perhaps you can still be what you were born to be, a warrior, but fighting now for eternal rather than earthly glory. Or perhaps you're fooling yourself, finding Saxon meanings in Roman religion, making Christ into Woden by another name. Time will tell. Time always tells. The Synod of Whitby. The double monastery of Whitby stood on its cliff above the North Sea, like a ship's prow cutting into heaven. And in its great hall in 664 AD, the future of English Christianity would be decided by an argument about haircuts and the date of Easter. This was not truly about astronomy or fashion, but about identity, authority, and whether English Christianity would look to Rome or to the Celtic churches that had kept faith alive during the Saxon darkness. Abbess Hilda presided over Whitby, one of those remarkable women who emerged in the early English church to wield power impossible in secular society. Born a Deiran princess, baptized at 13 by Paulinus, educated by Celtic monks, she embodied the very conflict the synod sought to resolve. Her monastery followed Celtic practices, learned from Aidan of Lindisfarne, that holy man from Iona who had converted Northumbria after Paulinus fled. Monks and nuns lived in separated communities, but shared worship, resources, and learning. They calculated Easter by the old British tables, wore their tonsure from ear to ear, and maintained an ascetic tradition that made Roman clergy seem worldly in comparison. King Oswiu of Northumbria had called this synod from personal as much as political necessity. He followed Celtic Christianity, celebrating Easter by Irish calculation. His wife, Eanfled, raised in Kent, followed Roman practice. This meant that while the king feasted on Easter Sunday, the queen still fasted for Palm Sunday, their very marriage bed divided by calendrical dispute. If a royal household could not agree when to celebrate Christ's resurrection, how could a kingdom maintain unity? The Celtic position was argued by Coolman of Lindisfarne, an Irishman whose sanctity was acknowledged even by his opponents. Through an interpreter, for the Irish and Roman parties could barely understand each other's Latin pronunciations, he argued from tradition. St. Columba had calculated Easter this way. St. Patrick had calculated Easter this way. John, the beloved disciple himself, who had laid his head on Christ's breast at the Last Supper, had celebrated Easter on the 14th day of Nisan, regardless of the day of the week. Who were they to change what saints and apostles had established? But tradition met its match in Wilfrid, a Northumbrian noble who had travelled to Rome, studied in Lyon, and returned burning with continental sophistication and Roman certainty. At 30 years old, tonsured in the Roman circle, wearing vestments of purple silk that outshone anything in Northumbria, he represented a new generation that saw isolation as weakness, not purity. His Latin was fluent, eloquent, and cutting. The Celtic Church, he argued, set itself against the entire Christian world. Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, Rome, all calculated Easter by the new tables. Were the Irish and British alone correct, while the churches founded by apostles were wrong? Wilfrid's masterstroke was invoking St. Peter. Christ had given Peter the keys to heaven, had he not? All agreed this was scripture. And where was Peter's church? Rome. Where did Peter's successor, the Pope, rule? Rome. If they must choose between the tradition of Columba, holy though he was, and the authority of Peter, doorkeeper of heaven, whom would they choose? When they died and stood before heaven's gates, would they argue with Peter that Columba's calculation was superior? King Oswiu had listened in silence through hours of theological debate, but this simple question decided him. He had killed men, broken oaths, seized kingdoms, sins enough to bar heaven's gates. He needed Peter's favour more than Columba's. With a decision that would echo through centuries, he declared for Rome. Northumbria would follow Roman practice in all things. Easter would be calculated by the new tables. Monks would wear the circular tonsure. More fundamentally, the English Church would be part of the Universal Catholic Church, not an isolated Celtic enclave. Coleman could not accept this defeat. With 30 Irish monks and some English followers, he departed Lindisfarne forever, taking with him the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes with curious specificity, some of St. Cuthbert's bones. They sailed for Ireland, that repository of learning and sanctity that had sent so many missionaries to England, but would send few more. The age of Celtic Christianity in England was ending, though its influence would persist in illuminated manuscripts whose serpentine decorations married Irish artistry with Roman letters, in the extreme asceticism of hermits seeking God on wind-scoured islands, in a tradition of powerful abbesses that Rome would eventually suppress. The consequences rippled outward from Whitby like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Monasteries that had followed Celtic practice either conformed or emptied. Libraries were reorganised, with Roman texts given prominence over Irish compilations. The dating of reigns and battles was recalculated, creating confusion that persists in historical chronologies. Most significantly, channels of communication opened with continental Europe that had been closed since the Saxon conquest. English scholars travelled to Rome and returned with books, ideas, and ambitions. Continental merchants, assured of familiar religious practice, expanded trade with England. Within a generation, Theodore of Tarsus, a Greek-speaking Syrian appointed Archbishop of Canterbury by the Pope, would organize the English Church into a diocesan structure that survives today. He established schools that taught not just theology, but law, medicine, and classical literature. Students came from Ireland, Gaul, even Spain to study in Canterbury and York. The English, who had been barbarian invaders 2 centuries before, were becoming teachers of Europe. Yet something was lost at Whitby, a different vision of Christianity that emphasized personal sanctity over institutional authority, communal property over hierarchical wealth, the spiritual authority of abbesses alongside bishops, and a mystical connection to creation that saw God's presence in sacred wells and holy trees as readily as in Roman basilicas. The Celtic Christians had kept the gospel alive in Britain when Rome abandoned it. Now Rome reclaimed what Celtic faith had preserved, transforming it into something more organized, more powerful, but perhaps less wondrous. The venerable Bede's candle. In the monastery of Jarrow, where the River Tyne meets the North Sea, Brother Bede sits alone in his cell as midnight approaches on a May evening in 731 AD. He is 59 years old, an advanced age in a time when most men die before 40, and his eyes strain in the flickering light of a beeswax candle, a luxury permitted him because of the importance of his work. Through his window comes the sound of waves against the rocks below, and the calling of seabirds that nest in the cliff face, sounds that have accompanied every night of his life since he came here as a boy of 7. The manuscript before him is his life's great work, the ecclesiastical history of the English people, and tonight he writes its final passages. His hand, trained in Irish half-uncial script, but adapted to Roman clarity, moves steadily across the vellum, expensive calf skin that cost the lives of dozens of animals. Every sheet represents weeks of preparation, soaking, stretching, scraping, pumicing, until the surface is smooth as silk and white as fresh snow. Too precious to waste, which is why he drafts first on wax tablets, composing and recomposing until each sentence carries its full weight of meaning. He pauses to sharpen his quill, a goose feather from the monastery's flock, cutting the tip at precisely the angle that produces his characteristic script. The ink, made from oak galls and iron salts, according to a recipe learned from Irish monks, flows black as northern storms onto the pale page. He has been writing since Matins, through Lords and Prime, missing meals to maintain the thread of narrative that connects British antiquity to English present. His stomach growls, but hunger is an old companion to monks who fast more days than they feast. The story he tells is unprecedented, a history not of kings and battles primarily, though these appear, but of conversion and sanctity, of how the English became not just Christians, but a chosen people with a divine mission. He writes in Latin, the universal language of learning, but a Latin inflected with English rhythms and occasional words, for which Rome had no equivalent. How else to describe a wergild or a Whitenage-mot, concepts foreign to classical civilization, but essential to English society? His sources lie scattered across his desk, a fortune in manuscripts that Jarrow has accumulated through decades of careful collection. Gildas's bitter account of British collapse, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's terse annals, letters from popes and archbishops, royal charters, and cemetery inscriptions, oral testimonies from witnesses to miracles and battles. He has corresponded with monasteries across England, Ireland, and the continent, creating a network of information that makes him, in his isolated Northumbrian cell, perhaps the most well-informed man in Europe about English affairs. But tonight he writes not from sources, but from memory, his own memory of England's golden age under the great Northumbrian kings. He remembers Edwin's conversion. Though he was just a child, the excitement that rippled through the kingdom as temples became churches. He knew personally many of the saints whose lives he chronicles. Cuthbert, the hermit bishop, had blessed him as a young monk. Adomnan of Iona had stayed at Jarrow and shared Irish traditions that Bede carefully weaves into his Roman narrative, acknowledging Celtic contributions while affirming Roman supremacy. The candle gutters, and he pauses to trim the wick with bronze scissors, a simple action that brings metaphorical clarity. His history, he realizes, is like this candle, bringing light to darkness, but consuming itself in the process. Once his book is copied and distributed, the oral traditions he has preserved will fade, replaced by his written authority. He has chosen which stories to tell and which to omit, which miracles to authenticate and which to question, shaping how future generations will understand their past. He has been careful with miracles, applying scholarly skepticism unusual for his age. When multiple witnesses confirm an event, he records it as fact. When testimony is singular or doubtful, he phrases it as, "it is said," or tradition relates. Yet he believes miracles occur, has perhaps witnessed them himself. The time when plague struck the monastery and brothers died daily until prayers to St. Cuthbert brought sudden healing. The manuscript that survived a shipwreck unblemished while everything else was destroyed. Signs that God watches over the English Church with particular favour. As he writes his conclusion, summarising the state of English kingdoms in 731 AD, he allows himself a moment of quiet pride. From the ruins of Roman Britain and the chaos of Saxon conquest has emerged a Christian civilization that rivals any in Europe. Northumbrian monks illuminate manuscripts that are traded for their beauty as far as Italy. The school at York, which he helped establish, draws students from across the Christian world. English missionaries are beginning to evangelize the Germans, returning the gospel to the very peoples who had brought paganism to Britain. Offa's Dyke and Mercian glory. Between 757 and 796 AD, Offa of Mercia ruled more of Britain than any king since the Romans, and his great earthwork along the Welsh frontier stands today as perhaps the most impressive physical monument of Anglo-Saxon England. 150 miles long, up to 20 feet high with a ditch 12 feet deep. Offa's Dyke represents an engineering achievement that required the mobilization of thousands of workers and an administrative sophistication that challenges our assumptions about Dark Age governance. Stand at any point along the dyke, particularly where it crosses the high ridges of the Clun Forest, and you begin to understand Offa's vision. This was not merely a defensive barrier, but a statement of power rendered in earth and timber. It defined where civilization ended and barbarism began, though Welsh poets viewing it from the western side would have reversed those definitions. Every foot of its length proclaimed that here ruled a king powerful enough to reshape the landscape itself, to draw a line across Britain and make it real through human labour and royal will. Offa inherited a Mercia that was already the dominant power in southern England, but he transformed it into something approaching a unified state. From his capital at Tamworth, he controlled a territory stretching from the Welsh mountains to the North Sea, from the Thames to the Humber. London, Canterbury, even briefly Kent itself acknowledged his overlordship. He called himself King of the English, anticipating by a century the political reality of a united England. His coinage revolutionized English economy and proclaimed his imperial pretensions. The silver penny he introduced, bearing his portrait in conscious imitation of Roman emperors, became the standard currency for centuries. On some coins, he styled himself Rex, on others, Magnus, and most audaciously, his queen Cynethryth appeared on her own coins, the only Anglo-Saxon queen so honoured. These coins travelled the trade routes, from Iceland to Baghdad, where archaeologists have found them in medieval Islamic hoards, silent testimony to England's reintegration into world commerce. The construction of the dyke required administrative machinery that anticipates later medieval government. Every hide of land in Mercia owed labour service, calculated precisely according to agricultural capacity and population. Surveyors planned the route, choosing ridgelines for maximum visibility and psychological impact. Engineers designed the profile steeper on the Welsh side to disadvantage attackers, with periodic gaps at traditional crossing points where fortified gates could control and tax movement. Work gangs were organised by shire and hundred, each responsible for specific sections marked by wooden posts that archaeological excavation still occasionally uncovers. But the dike was more than military engineering. It created a frontier zone where different economies and cultures met and mingled despite official separation. Welsh cattle drovers brought beasts to English markets through designated crossing points. English merchants carried manufactured goods, particularly high-quality textiles and metalwork, into Wales. At places like Knighton and Montgomery, trading settlements grew up along the dike. Bilingual communities, where Welsh silver purchased English grain and English coins bought Welsh horses. Offa's international ambitions matched his domestic achievements. He corresponded as an equal with Charlemagne, the greatest ruler in Western Europe. Their letters, preserved in continental archives, discuss trade agreements, marriage alliances, and the standardization of weights and measures to facilitate commerce. When Charlemagne closed Frankish ports to English merchants over some diplomatic slight, Offa retaliated by banning Frankish traders from England, an economic warfare that both rulers quickly realized hurt them equally. They resolved their dispute with an exchange of gifts, Charlemagne sending a Frankish sword and silk vestments, Offa responding with English woolen cloaks that were the luxury textile of the age. The church benefited from and enabled Offa's power. He founded monasteries and endowed churches, but always with political calculation. When the Archbishop of Canterbury proved insufficiently compliant, Offa persuaded Pope Adrian I to create a new archbishopric at Lichfield in Mercia, breaking Canterbury's monopoly on ecclesiastical authority. He stage-managed the discovery of St Alban's bones, providing Mercia with its own national saint to rival Canterbury's grip on English Christianity. His daughter Elflade became an abbess, wielding spiritual authority that complemented her father's temporal power. Yet Offa's achievement proved personal rather than institutional. His son Ecgfrith survived him by only 5 months, dying under mysterious circumstances that suggest assassination. Within a decade of Offa's death, Mercia fragmented under pressure from Wessex and Viking raids. The administrative structures he created, the networks of loyalty and obligation, the careful balance of force and persuasion, all depended on a king strong enough to maintain them. Without Offa, Mercia reverted to its constituent parts, a collection of shires and peoples rather than a kingdom. The coming of the Northmen. On the 8th day of June, 793 AD, the monks of Lindisfarne were preparing for the feast of St Medard when they saw the ships. 4 vessels, their square sails blood-red in the morning sun, approaching from the northeast faster than any ships should move against the wind. The monks, accustomed to trading vessels and fishing boats, felt curiosity rather than fear. Some walked down to the beach to greet these unexpected visitors, perhaps pilgrims come to venerate St Cuthbert's shrine. They were still walking when the warriors leaped from the ships, axes already swinging, and the holiest place in Northumbria became a slaughterhouse. The attack lasted perhaps 3 hours, though survivors' accounts stretch time through trauma into eternal moments of horror. The Vikings, for this is the name history gives these sea raiders, though they called themselves many things, were methodical in their violence. They knew exactly what they sought, precious metals, regardless of sacred function. The Gospel books with their jewelled covers, the silver chalices and golden crosses, the reliquaries containing saints' bones in crystal and gold, all became plunder. Illuminated manuscripts, representing decades of monastic labour, they tossed aside as worthless, though some they used to kindle fires that consumed the wooden buildings. What shocked Christian Europe was not merely the violence, for this was a violent age, but the sacrilege. Warriors might kill each other over honour or land, but monasteries were sacred. protected by supernatural sanction that even the most brutal kings respected. The Vikings recognized no such immunity. To them, monasteries were perfect targets. Wealthy, undefended, conveniently located on coasts and rivers for rapid seaborne assault. The very isolation that monks sought for spiritual contemplation made them vulnerable to maritime raiders who used the sea as highways. Alcuin of York, Charlemagne's English advisor, wrote from the Frankish court with apocalyptic horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as prey to pagan peoples." He saw divine judgment in the attack, punishment for English sins, though he struggled to explain why God would use pagans as instruments of correction. The Lindisfarne attack was not the first Viking raid on Britain. 4 years earlier, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, Northmen had landed at Portland in Dorset. The local reeve rode to meet them, assuming they were traders, requiring direction to the proper market. They killed him immediately, the first recorded Viking victim in England, though surely not the first in reality. But Lindisfarne was different. This was targeted, deliberate, an attack on the spiritual heart of English Christianity that announced a new kind of enemy had arrived. These Northmen came from the fjords and forests of Scandinavia, driven by forces historians still debate. Population pressure in narrow Norwegian valleys, perhaps. Political consolidation that pushed defeated warbands to seek fortune abroad. Climate improvement that made northern agriculture more productive, creating surplus population. Technological innovation in shipbuilding that made long-distance raiding feasible. Or simply the eternal human hunger for wealth and glory given new opportunity by maritime mobility. Their ships were masterworks of engineering that gave them decisive tactical advantage. The longship, with its shallow draft and symmetrical design, could navigate rivers that would ground conventional vessels. It could be rowed when wind failed, sailed when wind served, and even portaged over short distances between river systems. Its speed under oar, perhaps 6 knots in bursts, meant it could outrun any pursuer. Its flexibility meant Vikings could strike anywhere water reached, appearing without warning, vanishing before response could organize. Rivers of silver, rivers of blood. The decade following, Lindisfarne saw the Norse sea wolves prowling Britain's coasts with increasing boldness, their dragon-proud ships becoming nightmare visions that sent monks fleeing inland with whatever treasures they could carry. 794 brought them back to Northumbria, attacking Jarrow, where Bede had written his history. But here they met resistance. The monks fought back, and a storm wrecked several Viking ships, their crews washing ashore to be slaughtered by Northumbrian warriors, who saw divine justice in the weather's intervention. 795 saw the Isle of Iona ravaged, Columba's holy island defiled, its monks scattered or enslaved. The Sacred Heart of Celtic Christianity, which had survived the Synod of Whitby's theological defeat, could not survive Viking steel. By 800 AD, the attacks had evolved from hit-and-run raids to systematic exploitation. The Vikings established winter camps on convenient islands, using them as bases for summer raiding seasons. They developed intelligence networks, learning from captured monks or tortured traders, which monasteries held the greatest treasures, which towns would pay ransom to avoid burning, which rivers led deepest into rich, agricultural lands. They became students of English political geography, understanding that Northumbria's civil wars, Mercia's succession disputes, and Wessex's preoccupation with Cornish rebellions created opportunities for profitable intervention. The economics of Viking raiding operated on multiple levels. Immediate plunder, gold and silver transformed into arm rings, and hack silver, the currency of Scandinavian gift exchange economy. Slaves, especially young women and skilled craftsmen, who commanded high prices in Dublin's slave markets or further east in the Swedish trading posts along Russian rivers. But increasingly, the Vikings discovered that the threat of violence could be more profitable than violence itself. Danegeld, the payment of tribute to prevent raiding, became a recurring feature of English life. A monastery might pay £30 of silver for a season's peace. A trading town might offer 50. A kingdom, faced with coordinated Viking armies, might surrender hundreds of pounds. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records these payments with bitter precision. And this year, the men of Kent made peace with the host and gave them £3,000. Each payment announced weakness, encouraging future attacks. Yet what alternative existed for communities that lacked military force to resist professional warriors who appeared from the sea without warning? The silver flowed eastward in rivers, transforming Scandinavian society as profoundly as the raids transformed English. Archaeological excavations in Gotland have uncovered hoards containing tens of thousands of English coins, buried wealth that represents only a fraction of what was taken. This influx of capital funded political consolidation in Scandinavia, enabling ambitious jarls to hire larger war bands, build bigger ships, and undertake more ambitious expeditions. The Viking Age was self-reinforcing. Successful raids created resources for larger raids, which yielded greater resources for still larger operations. The Great Heathen Army. In 865 AD, the nature of Viking interaction with England changed fundamentally. What landed in East Anglia, the autumn was not another raiding party seeking quick plunder, but an army of conquest, what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls a great heathen host. Thousands of warriors, accompanied by horses, supplies, and the clear intention to stay. Led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, and his brothers Halfdan and Ubba, this force would nearly succeed in conquering all of England, ending Anglo-Saxon civilization, just as the Saxons had once ended Romano-British culture. The army's first move revealed strategic sophistication. Rather than attack East Anglia immediately, they negotiated with King Edmund, accepting tribute and horses in exchange for temporary peace. This gave them a secure base, local intelligence, and most importantly, mobility. Viking armies had previously been limited by the speed of their longships along coasts and rivers. Now, mounted on English horses, they could strike anywhere, moving faster than defending armies could respond. They had transformed from maritime raiders into a land-based military force, while retaining their naval mobility, a combination that made them nearly unstoppable. 866 saw them ride north to York, exploiting a Northumbrian civil war between rival claimants Aela and Osbert. The Vikings took the city on All Saints' Day, November 1st, when the warriors were drunk from festival celebrations. The Northumbrian kings temporarily united against this common enemy, but when they attempted to retake York in March 867, the Vikings slaughtered both armies and both kings. According to later legend, Ivar blood-eagled Aela, cutting his ribs from his spine and spreading them like wings. A sacrifice to Odin for victory, though this might be Christian propaganda, emphasizing pagan brutality. From Northumbria, the army wheeled south into Mercia, establishing winter quarters at Nottingham. King Burgred of Mercia called on his brother-in-law, Aethelred of Wessex, for aid, and their combined armies confronted the Vikings. But the Great Heathen Army had learned from Roman military manuals found in conquered monasteries. They fortified their position and refused battle, knowing that English armies, composed of farmers and local levies, could not maintain long sieges. After weeks of standoff, Burgred paid massive tribute for the Vikings to leave, a tactical victory that was a strategic disaster, funding their next campaign. In 869, they returned to East Anglia, no longer as negotiating partners, but as conquerors. King Edmund, later canonized as Saint Edmund the Martyr, refused to submit, The details of his death vary in different sources, but all agree on its brutality. Tied to a tree and shot full of arrows like Saint Sebastian, or beheaded after torture, or both, Edmund became a symbol of Christian resistance to pagan oppression. His death marks the end of East Anglia as an independent kingdom. The Vikings appointed a puppet king and began something new: permanent settlement. 870 saw the great heathen army's most ambitious campaign. A full-scale invasion of Wessex, the last major independent English kingdom. They established a fortified base at Reading, where the Thames and Kennet rivers meet, creating a position that controlled major communication routes, while remaining accessible to Viking ships, bringing reinforcements and supplies. The war that followed would determine whether England would remain English or become a Norse colony, like Iceland or the Hebrides. You hide in the Somerset marshes. You are Wulfstan, sworn warrior to King Alfred of Wessex, though there is precious little kingdom left to defend, and even less kingliness about your lord's current circumstances. It is February 878 AD, and you crouch in a fisherman's hut on the Isle of Athelney, deep in the Somerset levels, where solid ground gives way to reed, marsh, and channels of black water that shift with every tide. Your boots, once fine leather, given by the king himself for valour at Ashdown, have rotted in the perpetual damp. Your mailcoat, which you dare not remove for fear of sudden attack, has rusted despite daily oiling, each ring leaving orange stains on the rough wool tunic beneath. The hut stinks of smoked eel and desperation. 12 men huddle in a space meant for 4, the greatest nobles of Wessex reduced to eating marsh birds and barley stolen from their own estates now occupied by Danes. King Alfred sits by the smoking fire, his harp across his knees, composing a psalm in the West Saxon dialect. Even here, even now, he insists on maintaining court rituals. You still address him as Lord King, still kneel when approaching him, sighs, though kneeling means sinking into mud that seeps through every gap in your clothing. Through the door of woven reeds, you can see the winter marsh stretching endlessly, a labyrinth of water and wetland that has become your salvation. The Danes control every burh, every crossroads, every bridge in Wessex, but they cannot control this shifting landscape where paths appear and disappear with the tides, where a man who knows the ways can vanish into mist and reed, where heavy Danish war gear becomes a drowning weight rather than protection. Local marsh dwellers, Saxon and British alike, guide you through routes marked by bent willows and heron nests, accepting Alfred's promise of future reward when many doubt he has a future at all. The news that filters into your refuge is universally grim. Guthrum the Dane sits in Alfred's palace at Chippenham, wearing Alfred's crown, sleeping in Alfred's bed. Danish armies march unopposed through Wessex, extracting tribute and submission. Ealdormen, who swore sacred oaths to Alfred, now kneel to Guthrum, justifying betrayal as pragmatism. Even Alfred's brother-in-law, Aethelred of Mercia, sends no aid, perhaps calculating that Wessex's fall might enhance Mercian independence. The great kingdoms of the English, Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and now Wessex, have all fallen to Danish power. You are not defending a kingdom, but a memory. Not serving a king, but a fugitive. Yet Alfred maintains strange confidence. He tells stories of King David hiding from Saul, of Christ's 40 days in the wilderness, of how God tests those he loves most severely. He spends hours writing in a wax tablet, working on his translation of Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care from Latin to English, an absurd project for a king without a kingdom. When you suggest that survival might require accepting Danish overlordship, as other English kings have done, his grey eyes flash with the only anger he permits himself. If we forget who we are, he says, victory becomes meaningless. Your days follow a pattern of tedious survival, punctuated by mortal danger. Before dawn, you check the fish traps, wading through water so cold it burns, finding perhaps 3 small eels that will flavour barley porridge for 20 men. Mid-morning brings weapons drill on the only solid ground, a half-acre island where you practice shield wall tactics with farmers and fishermen who have joined your desperate band, teaching them that courage matters more than skill when standing shoulder to shoulder. Afternoons are for intelligence gathering, slipping through reed beds to observe Danish patrols, noting their numbers and routines, building the knowledge that might someday prove useful if you live long enough to use it. The Warrior Scholar King. By May 878 AD, Alfred emerged from the Athelney marshes, not as the desperate fugitive who had entered them, but as a king reborn through trial. The transformation began with a single victory at Edington, where his hastily gathered fyrds stood against Guthrum's professional warriors and, against all probability, held their ground. The shield walls met with a crash that survivors said could be heard a mile away, and for hours the outcome balanced on the edge of individual courage and collective will. When the Danes finally broke, fleeing to their fortification at Chippenham, Alfred had won not just a battle, but the moral authority to rebuild a kingdom. The peace negotiations that followed revealed Alfred's understanding that military victory alone could not secure Wessex's future. Rather than demanding impossible tribute or humiliating submission, he offered Guthrum something unprecedented: legitimate kingship over East Anglia and parts of Mercia, conditional on conversion to Christianity. The ceremony at Aller, where Guthrum accepted baptism with Alfred as his godfather, created a new political reality. The Dane became Athelstan, Christian king, bound by sacred oaths that even Vikings respected. The partition of England between English, Wessex, and Danish-ruled territories, what would become known as the Danelaw, transformed raiders into neighbours, creating stable borders where chaos had reigned. But Alfred understood that surviving one Danish army meant little when the northern seas teemed with potential invaders. He revolutionised English defence by creating the Burgle system, a network of fortified towns never more than 20 miles apart, roughly a day's march for the fyrd. Each burh was designed according to mathematical principles. Alfred had learned from Roman military manuals: walls proportioned to population, gates positioned for maximum defence, internal streets laid out for rapid movement of defenders. The Burghal Heidage, a document listing the defensive obligations of each fortification, represents administrative genius, calculating precisely how many men each region must provide based on the length of walls they must defend. These burhs were more than military installations. They became centres of trade, administration, and justice, creating urban life where none had existed since Roman times. Alfred insisted that legal proceedings occur in burhs, that markets operate within their walls, that mints produce standardised coinage there. By concentrating economic activity in defensible locations, he made Viking raiding less profitable, while creating wealth that funded further defensive measures. Winchester, his capital, grew from a modest royal estate to a true city, with paved streets, regulated markets, and scriptoriums producing books that spread English learning across Europe. Alfred's legal reforms went beyond military necessity to reshape English society. His law code, prefaced with his own translation of the Ten Commandments and excerpts from Exodus, explicitly connected English law to divine law, making legal observance a religious duty. He standardised penalties across his kingdom, ensuring that a crime in Devon received the same punishment as in Kent. He established that even slaves had legal rights, that women could own property independently, that education created obligation to serve the common good. Most radically, he insisted that legal proceedings be conducted in English rather than Latin, making justice accessible to common people. The educational program Alfred initiated represents perhaps his greatest legacy. Lamenting that Viking destruction had eliminated Latin learning from England, he mandated that all freeborn boys learn to read English, with promising students continuing to Latin. He personally translated essential texts: Gregory's Pastoral Care for Priests, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy for Nobles Facing Adversity, Bede's Ecclesiastical History, to remind the English of their Christian heritage. His court became a centre of international scholarship, attracting Grimbald from Francia, John from Saxon Germany, and Asa from Wales, creating an intellectual renaissance in what had been Europe's barbarian fringe. Alfred's military innovations extended beyond defensive fortifications. He created England's first navy, building ships that his own design specified should be twice as long as Viking vessels, higher-sided for advantage in boarding actions, and crewed by experienced Frisian sailors recruited with generous pay. These ships didn't need to defeat Viking fleets decisively. They only needed to make raiding expensive and uncertain. He reorganized the Fyrd into rotating divisions, ensuring that armed men were always available while others tended agriculture, solving the perpetual medieval problem of maintaining defense without destroying the economy. By his death in 899 AD, Alfred had transformed Wessex from the weakest English kingdom into the foundation of future England. His son Edward and daughter Ethelflaed would continue his work, gradually conquering the Danelaw and creating a unified English kingdom. But more than territory, Alfred bequeathed an idea that kingship meant more than warfare, that civilization required learning, law, and faith working in harmony. His epitaph, Alfred, King of the Anglo-Saxons, claimed a title that hadn't existed before him and wouldn't exist after him, marking the transitional moment when multiple kingdoms began becoming one nation, the birth of English. In the scriptorium of Winchester, late in Alfred's reign, an unnamed scribe made a decision that would echo through centuries. Tasked with translating Orosius's History Against the Pagans from Latin, he encountered a passage describing Germanic tribes beyond Rome's frontiers. Rather than translate literally, he inserted an entirely new section, an account of voyages to the White Sea told by Othere, a Norwegian visitor to Alfred's court. He wrote not in Latin but in English, the West Saxon dialect that Alfred promoted, creating one of the first pieces of original English prose that wasn't translation, law code, or chronicle entry. A language was being born from the fusion of Germanic grammar, Latin learning, and the necessities of describing a new world. Old English in Alfred's time was actually 4 major dialects: West Saxon, Mercian, Northumbrian, and Kentish. Mutually intelligible, but distinct enough that a Winchester scribe might struggle with Northumbrian poetry. The Viking invasions, paradoxically, accelerated English linguistic unity. As Danish settlement created the Danelaw, English speakers found themselves defining their identity partly through language. English became not just an ethnic designation, but a linguistic one, distinguishing those who spoke Anglo-Saxon from those who spoke Danish, though in practice the languages were similar enough that bilingualism flourished in border regions. The influence of Latin through the Church and of Old Norse through Danish settlement created a peculiarly flexible language. Where French would later maintain linguistic purity through academy regulation, English absorbed foreign vocabulary voraciously. Latin gave English abstract concepts: angel, altar, school. Old Norse contributed everyday words so fundamental we forget their borrowings: skill, skin, skull, sky, knife, husband, berserk. Sometimes both languages provided alternatives, creating the synonym-rich English we know today. Sick from Norse, ill from English, skill from Norse, craft from English. Alfred's translation program did more than preserve learning. It created English as a literary language. When he translated firmamentum as Rodor, the vast arch of heaven, he wasn't finding equivalents, but creating new conceptual possibilities. His translation of Boethius required inventing English philosophical vocabulary turning providence into forethought, a compound that captures divine planning through Anglo-Saxon cognitive metaphors. These weren't mechanical translations, but creative transformations, making classical thought speak through Germanic linguistic structures. The Winchester scriptorium, where Alfred's translations were copied and distributed, became a laboratory for English prose style. Scribes developed conventions for written English that hadn't existed when writing meant Latin. How to indicate word boundaries in a language with complex compounds, how to represent sounds Latin letters never accommodated, how to punctuate sentences structured differently from Latin periods. The distinctive insular script they developed, with its characteristic letter forms and abbreviations, made English manuscripts immediately recognizable across Europe. The Danelaw frontier, along an invisible line running roughly from London to Chester, two worlds met and mingled in the late 9th century. South and west lay English England, Alfred's domain and his successors' inheritance. North and east stretched the Danelaw, where Danish jarls ruled from York and Lincoln, where Thor's hammer competed with Christ's cross, where children grew up bilingual, switching languages as easily as changing clothes. This frontier, porous and shifting, created something new, a hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian culture that would fundamentally alter what it meant to be English. In market towns along the boundary, the mixing was most intense. At Stamford or Cambridge, English farmers brought grain to Danish merchants who paid in Arabic silver dirhams that had travelled trade routes from Baghdad through Kiev to York. Legal proceedings operated under negotiated compromise. English law for English defendants, Danish law for Danes, and an emerging merchant law for disputes that crossed ethnic lines. Weights and measures had to be standardised, creating systems that satisfied both communities. Even time itself was negotiated, with some following the English ecclesiastical calendar, while others marked seasons by Norse festivals. The place names tell stories of coexistence and conflict. Pure English names like Birmingham sit beside pure Danish Nottingham. But most interesting are the hybrids. Grimston combines the Danish personal name Grim with the English tun for settlement. Burnby merges English burn for stream with Danish by for farm. These weren't just administrative conveniences, but evidence of intermarriage, of children who inherited from both traditions, of communities that couldn't be easily categorized as conqueror or conquered. Edward and Ethelflaed. When Alfred died in October 899 AD, his son Edward inherited not just a kingdom, but a vision of English unity that would require military genius and political subtlety to achieve. Edward, called the Elder by later historians, to distinguish him from his great-grandson Edward the Confessor, possessed his father's strategic mind, but added a ruthlessness Alfred's Christian mercy had tempered. His sister Aethelflaed, married to Aldorman Aethelred of Mercia, but ruling independently after his death, proved equally formidable. Together, they would orchestrate the conquest of the Danelaw through coordinated campaigns that demonstrated Anglo-Saxon military evolution, from desperate defence to calculated offence. Aethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, deserves recognition as one of medieval Europe's most successful military commanders. From her fortress at Stafford, she directed campaigns that systematically reduced Danish power in the Midlands. Her strategy avoided direct confrontation with Danish armies. Instead, targeting their economic infrastructure, she built Burse at Bridgenorth, Tamworth, and Warwick, creating a network of fortifications that strangled Danish trade routes. When she took Derby in 917 AD, personally leading the assault, Danish Mercia effectively ceased to exist as an independent power. The conquest of the Danelaw proceeded not through a single dramatic campaign, but through decades of calculated pressure. Edward and Athelflaed coordinated their movements like pincers, Edward advancing north from Wessex, while Athelflaed pushed east from Mercia. When Edward besieged Bedford, Aethelflaed threatened Leicester, forcing Danish forces to divide. When Danish armies from York marched south, the siblings would retreat to their burhs, forcing the Danes to exhaust themselves against fortifications, while English forces raided their undefended territories. By 920 AD, Edward received submissions from all the Danish armies south of the Humber. The kings of York, Scotland, and Strathclyde acknowledged his overlordship, though what this meant in practice remained deliberately vague. He styled himself King of the Anglo-Saxons, claiming authority over all English-speaking peoples, regardless of their current political allegiance. His son Athelstan would complete the conquest, taking York in 927 AD and becoming the first king to rule all of what we now call England. Athelstan, first king of all England. In 927 AD, at Emont Bridge near Penrith, where the rivers Emont and Lowther meet in a landscape of gentle hills and morning mist, the impossible became real. Constantine of Scotland, Owain of Strathclyde, Hywel of Wales, and even Ealdred of Bamborough, the last independent English lord of Northumbria, knelt before Athelstan of Wessex and acknowledged him as their overlord. The grandson of Alfred the Great, who had hidden in the marshes as a fugitive, now stood as Rex Totius Britanniae, king of all Britain, a title no one had claimed since the Romans abandoned these shores 5 centuries before. Athelstan was an unlikely architect of unity. Never married, possibly homosexual according to some historians, reading between the chronicle lines, certainly devoted to a masculine warrior culture that found its highest expression in brotherhood of arms rather than dynastic marriage. Raised at the Mercian court by his aunt Aethelflaed, he understood both English and Danish customs, spoke multiple languages, and cultivated a cosmopolitan court that attracted scholars, poets, and princes from across Europe. His collection of religious relics, obsessive even by medieval standards, included fragments of the True Cross, the Crown of Thorns, and the Sword of Constantine, creating a sacred treasury that legitimized his rule through divine association. The kingdom, Athelstan, inherited from his father Edward, was already the largest English realm ever assembled, but it remained a collection of conquered territories rather than a unified state. His genius lay in transforming military domination into cultural integration. He issued law codes that applied equally to English and Danish subjects, carefully balancing traditional customs with royal innovation. His coinage, minted in dozens of towns from York to Exeter, bore consistent designs and legends proclaiming him King of all Britain, creating visual unity across diverse regions. Every silver penny carried his message: one king, one kingdom, one destiny. His court at Winchester became medieval Europe's most sophisticated north of the Alps. Foreign ambassadors reported with amazement on ceremonies that blended English, Danish, and British traditions into something entirely new. Norwegian princes sent their sons to learn statecraft. Frankish nobles sought English wives. Even Harold Fairhair of Norway, the legendary unifier of that kingdom, sent his son Hakon to be fostered at Athelstan's court, creating connections that would shape North Sea politics for generations. The administrative machinery Athelstan created anticipated later medieval government by centuries. He divided England into shires, and hundreds with standardized obligations for military service, road maintenance, and fortress repair. He appointed ealdormen, who reported directly to the king rather than ruling as hereditary nobles, making them administrators rather than autonomous princes. His chancery produced writs and charters in systematic format, creating documentary precedent for royal authority. When he held court at York, Exeter, or London, he brought the same legal procedures, the same ceremonial forms, making kingship portable and consistent. Yet beneath this administrative success lay constant military threat. The Norse of Dublin, expelled from Ireland, sought new homes in northern England. The Scots resented English dominance. Welsh princes accepted overlordship only when English armies compelled it. The kingdom's unity depended on Athelstan's ability to project force anywhere in Britain at short notice, maintaining what historians call a hegemonic peace, through threat, rather than constant warfare. Athelstan's international engagement exceeded anything attempted by English kings before or after. He married his sisters to European royalty, one to Otto, future Holy Roman Emperor, another to Hugh, Duke of the Franks, a third to the Viking King of York. Before that arrangement collapsed in bloodshed, he corresponded with Byzantine emperors and Coptic patriarchs. When Louis, heir to the Frankish throne, fled political turmoil, Athelstan sheltered him at the English court, creating a debt of gratitude that would pay dividends for generations. His death in 939 AD at Gloucester, possibly from kidney stones that contemporary accounts describe with excruciating medical detail, came at age 45, old for a warrior king who had fought in numerous battles. He was buried at Malmesbury Abbey, his favourite foundation, rather than with his predecessors at Winchester, a final assertion of individual choice over dynastic tradition. The succession passed smoothly to his half-brother Edmund, suggesting that Athelstan had managed what so few medieval kings achieved, creating institutions stable enough to survive their creator. Within 2 years of his death, the Danes of York had revolted, the Scots had invaded, and the Welsh had reclaimed independence. Yet the idea of England, of a single kingdom encompassing all English speakers, had been planted too deeply to uproot. Future kings might lose territory, face invasion, even accept foreign overlordship, but they would always style themselves kings of England, not Wessex or Mercia or Northumbria. Athelstan had created not just a kingdom but a concept, and concepts, once born, are remarkably difficult to kill. The Battle of Brunanburh, dawn on that day in 937 AD, came pale and cold across the Wirral Peninsula, where Constantine of Scotland had brought the largest invasion force Britain had seen since the Great Heathen Army. With him stood Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin with his Norse-Irish warriors, Owen of Strathclyde with his British cavalry, and scattered English dissidents, who preferred any king to Athelstan. Against them stood the combined fyrds of England, drawn from every shire south of the Humber, farmers and craftsmen standing beside professional warriors, united by nothing more than Athelstan's will and the idea of England he embodied. Young Aelfric, a Seol from Wiltshire, who had never travelled beyond his local 100 before the muster, found himself in the third rank of the shield wall. As the armies closed, his grandfather's sword, hidden in thatch through the Danish wars and Alfred's exile, trembled in his hand. The man beside him, a Dane from Lincoln, whose grandfather had come with the Great Heathen Army, muttered prayers to Christ in accented English. They were ancient enemies standing as brothers, about to face men who looked exactly like themselves. The battle began with the Scottish charge, Constantine's warriors running full speed toward the English line, screaming war cries in Gaelic that sounded like the howling of wolves. The English shield wall bent but held, that ancient Saxon formation that had stopped cavalry at Hastings and would stop it here. Spears thrust between locked shields, finding gaps in mail, piercing flesh, the mechanical repetition of killing that turned men into components of a larger machine. When the Norse-Irish hit the English right wing, the battle nearly turned. These were Vikings who had learned Irish ferocity, carrying axes that could split shields and skulls with equal ease. The English line wavered, began to break, until Athelstan himself appeared, his banner of a golden dragon on purple silk rallying the frightened farmers. The king fought not from horseback but on foot, in the wall with his men, his presence worth 1,000 warriors. The slaughter continued from dawn until dusk. 12 hours of killing that left the field carpeted with dead. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually terse in its entries, breaks into poetry to describe the carnage. Never yet in this island was their slaughter more harsh. Since Angles and Saxons came here from the east, 5 young kings died, 7 jarls of Ireland, uncounted thousands of common warriors. Constantine fled, leaving his son's corpse on the field. Olaf escaped with 20 men to his ships. The brooks ran red with blood for 3 days. When darkness ended the killing, Aelfric still lived, though the Dane beside him had fallen with an Irish spear through his throat. Walking among the dead, looking for wounded comrades to save or enemies to finish, Aelfric realised he could no longer tell English from Scot, Dane from Irish. Death had made them all equal, all British, all human. England had been preserved, but at a cost that made victory feel like defeat. He would return to Wiltshire, marry, father children, and never speak of what he had seen at Brunanburh, though sometimes his wife would wake to find him weeping in his sleep, fighting battles that would never end. A monastery's daily round, before the first birds sing, while stars still prick the darkness above Glastonbury Tor. Brother Dunstan rises from his straw pallet in the Daughter, the common sleeping hall, where 40 monks lie in neat rows, like Christ's soldiers awaiting resurrection. It is 3 in the morning, the hour of matins, and frost glazes the narrow windows that admit more cold than light in this December of 960 AD. He sleeps fully clothed in his rough woolen habit, adding only sandals before padding down worn stone stairs to the chapel, his breath visible in the candlelight. The chapel remains dark except for the single flame before the altar, that perpetual light that has burned since the monastery's foundation, fed by donations of oil from pilgrims seeking St. Patrick's intercession. As brothers gather, their shuffling feet and suppressed coughs create a human murmur beneath the vast stone silence. When the bells ring, bronze voices that carry across the sleeping marshlands, 40 voices rise as one in the ancient words of the psalm, Domini, labia mea aperis, Lord, open thou my lips. The Latin flows like water over stones, worn smooth by centuries of repetition, each monk's individual voice disappearing into the collective praise. After matins comes the return to sleep, that blessed second rest, until prime at sunrise. Then the cycle begins again. Terce at the 3rd hour, sext at noon, none at the 9th hour, vespers at sunset, compline before bed. Between these fixed points of prayer, the monastery hums with quiet activity. In the scriptorium, monks copy manuscripts, their fingers stiff with cold, despite the sheep's wool mittens, with the fingertips cut away for writing. In the garden, brothers tend herbs that will become medicines for the poor who gather at the gates each morning. In the kitchen, the daily porridge bubbles over peat fires, filling the air with the smell of barley and salvation. The library, Glastonbury's treasure, holds books rescued from Viking flames, their singed edges testament to near loss. Here rest Bede's histories, Aldhelm's riddles, anonymous saints' lives in Latin and Old English, even Greek texts that only Prior Aethelwold can read. Each book represents months of labour, entire herds of sheep transformed into vellum, oak galls and iron transformed into ink, human devotion transformed into knowledge preserved. The books sleep in wooden chests, wrapped in oiled leather against the eternal damp, waiting for minds worthy of their wisdom. As afternoon fades toward evening, the bell summons all to vespers, that liminal service between day and night. The setting sun streams through the western window, illuminating motes of dust that dance like tiny angels in the golden light. The monks' voices rise and fall in Gregorian melodies that seem to make the very stones resonate. This is the thin time when heaven presses close to earth, when prayers slip more easily through the veil between worlds. Tomorrow will bring the same routine, and tomorrow, until time ends or the monastery falls, whichever comes first. But tonight, in this moment of perfect repetition, eternity touches time, and all is well. The return of the Vikings, The longships returned to English waters in 980 AD, but these were not the desperate raiders of 2 centuries past, seeking quick plunder from defenceless monasteries. These were the organised forces of a centralised Danish monarchy, led by kings with ambitions that extended beyond silver to sovereignty. The attacks began almost playfully, probing raids on coastal settlements that tested English responses, measured the kingdom's strength, mapped its weaknesses. By 991 AD, the probes had become invasions, and England faced its greatest existential threat since Alfred had hidden in the Athelney marshes. The English kingdom that faced this renewed Viking threat was both stronger and weaker than Alfred's Wessex. Stronger in that it controlled all of England, commanded greater resources, maintained standing naval and military forces. Weaker in that its king, Aethelred, had earned the epithet unready, not meaning unready but poorly advised, a man whose every decision seemed calculated to worsen whatever crisis he faced. When he should have fought, he negotiated. When he should have negotiated, he fought. When he should have stood firm, he fled. His reign would last 38 years. A slow-motion catastrophe that transformed England from Athelstan's empire to a Danish colony. The Battle of Maldon in 991 AD epitomised English dysfunction. Byrhtnoth, ealdorman of Essex, allowed a Viking army to cross from Northey Island to the mainland for a fair fight, choosing honour over tactical advantage. His death and defeat became the subject of one of English literature's greatest poems, celebrating glorious failure rather than practical success. This was the English problem. They fought the wars of their grandfathers, maintaining heroic traditions while Vikings employed modern ruthlessness. Aethelred's solution was gold rather than steel. In 991, he paid £10,000 of silver for peace. In 994, £16,000. By 1012, the payment reached £48,000, a sum that stripped churches of their treasures and peasants of their savings. This Danegeld, as it became known, did not purchase peace but announced weakness. Each payment attracted more Vikings, like blood in water drawing sharks. The English economy, already strained by constant warfare, began to collapse under tributary demands that exceeded its productive capacity. The St. Brice's Day massacre of November 13, 1002 AD, marked Aethelred's complete moral collapse. Ordering the simultaneous murder of all Danes living in England, he unleashed a pogrom that killed thousands of settled Danish farmers, merchants, and their families. In Oxford, Danes seeking sanctuary in St. Fridswide's church were burned alive when townsmen set the building aflame. Among the dead was Gunhilda, sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. The massacre didn't eliminate the Danish threat, but transformed it from economic opportunism to personal vengeance. Sweyn's invasion of 1013 was not a raid but a conquest. Landing in the Humber, with an army that included Norwegian allies and English exiles, he marched south through the Danelaw, where populations that remembered Danish rule welcomed him as a liberator from Aethelred's incompetence. When London finally submitted in December, Aethelred fled to Normandy, where his wife Emma's relatives provided reluctant sanctuary. For the first time since the Romans, a foreign king ruled all of England. Canute's North Sea Empire. Sweyn Forkbeard's death, in February 1014 AD, might have restored English independence, but his son Snute possessed something his father had lacked: the vision to transform conquest into civilization. After a brief restoration of Aethelred, and a vicious civil war against his son, Edmund Ironside, Canute emerged in 1016 as undisputed King of England. What followed was not the harsh foreign occupation the English feared, but one of the most prosperous and peaceful reigns in early medieval history. Canute understood that ruling England required becoming English. He married Aethelred's widow Emma of Normandy, providing continuity with the old dynasty while preventing Norman intervention. He maintained English laws, appointed English advisors, and attended English churches with conspicuous piety. His law code, issued at Oxford in 1018, proclaimed his intention to rule according to Edgar's laws, invoking the last universally respected English king. He was a Danish conqueror who chose to be an English king. The North Sea Empire, snot assembled, encompassing England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, was not an occupation but an integration. English merchants gained access to Scandinavian markets and Baltic resources. Danish warriors found employment in England's reformed military. Norwegian timber built English ships that sailed to Iceland and beyond. This was the first truly international polity in medieval Europe, anticipating the maritime empires of later centuries. At Winchester, Knut held court with a magnificence that impressed even Byzantine ambassadors. He patronized English monasteries with lavish gifts, understanding that spiritual authority reinforced temporal power. The story of him commanding the tide to stop, often misunderstood as arrogance, was actually a demonstration of humility, showing courtiers that even kings must bow to natural law and, by extension, divine will. He walked barefoot to Durham Cathedral, prostrating himself before St. Cuthbert's shrine, performing English piety more convincingly than many English kings. Under Snut, England experienced something it hadn't known for generations: peace. The Chronicle records these years with unusual brevity, having no disasters to report. Agriculture recovered from decades of warfare. Trade flourished under consistent law and stable currency. Population grew as families no longer feared Viking raids or English pogroms. Churches were rebuilt, manuscripts copied, learning revived. It was an Indian summer of Anglo-Saxon civilization, all the more poignant for its brevity. Yet this stability depended entirely on Sinute's personal authority. When he died in 1035, at approximately 40 years old, his empire immediately fragmented. His sons fought over succession, Norway reclaimed independence, and England descended into dynastic confusion. By 1042, the English throne had passed to Edward, son of Ethelred and Emma, later known as the Confessor. The great North Sea Empire dissolved like morning mist, leaving only memories, and the nagging question of what might have been had Knut lived another 20 years or established stronger institutions to outlast him. Edward the Confessor's dream. In the year 1045, King Edward knelt alone in the old wooden church at Westminster, where Thames, mud, and royal ambition met in uneasy marriage. He was 40 years old, having spent 25 of those years in Norman exile, while Danes ruled his father's kingdom, and now he dreamed of building something that would outlast conquest and chaos. A great abbey that would rival anything in Normandy or France. A stone prayer for England's salvation. The vision had come to him, he claimed, from St. Peter himself, appearing in that liminal space between sleep and waking, where medieval minds found their deepest truths. Peter had promised that, if Edward built this abbey, England would be protected from its enemies. Whether divine vision or political calculation, Edward embraced the project with the passion of a man who had little else to embrace. His marriage to Edith Godwinson remained childless, possibly unconsummated. Edward's piety or preference keeping him from his wife's bed and ensuring dynastic crisis would follow his death. Every morning, Edward walked among the construction sites, his thin frame draped in simple wool despite his royal status, discussing architectural details with Norman master masons he had imported from his exile homeland. The abbey would be built in the new Romanesque style, with massive pillars and rounded arches that seemed to carry heaven's weight to earth. He personally selected stones from Caen, insisting on the white limestone that would gleam like salvation against London's grey skies. When workers complained about moving massive blocks through Thames mud, Edward worked beside them, his soft royal hands bloodied by rough rope, making his abbey a prayer of flesh as well as stone. The financing required innovation that anticipated later medieval statecraft. Edward granted the abbey exemption from all taxes, rights to river tolls, and income from royal estates across England. He created what historians would later call Westminster Liberties, an autonomous zone where abbey law superseded royal law, where fugitives could claim sanctuary, where merchants traded free from royal interference. He was building not just a church, but an institution that would survive the kingdoms that rose and fell around it. By 1065, as Edward lay dying, the abbey stood nearly complete, its twin towers rising above the marshes like hands raised in benediction. On December 28th, too weak to walk, but insisting on witnessing his dream's completion, Edward was carried to the consecration ceremony. The Vita Edwardi describes him weeping as the bishops blessed the altar where his tomb would soon rest. He had built his monument, his claim to sanctity, his gift to a kingdom that had never quite accepted this strange, pious, foreign-raised king. Within days he was dead, within years he was sainted, and within centuries his abbey would crown every English monarch, making his dream the ceremonial heart of a nation he had barely understood. You stand in the Wittenajmot. You are Godwin of Southwark, a middle-ranking thane whose grandfather earned his 5 hides of land fighting at Brunanburh, and on this 5th day of January, 1066 AD, you stand in the Great Hall at Westminster, as history balanced on a knife's edge. Outside, winter grips the Thames Valley with unusual severity, the river frozen solid enough that children play where ships should anchor. Inside, the air is thick with smoke from the central hearth, and thicker still, with the unspoken tension of men choosing between catastrophe and catastrophe. Edward the Confessor lies unburied in his new abbey, his death yesterday, leaving England without an heir for the first time since Alfred's line began. Around you stand the great men of England, Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, the kingdom's most powerful noble, and Edward's brother-in-law, Edgar Atheling, grandson of Edmund Ironside, barely 14 years old with the best hereditary claim, but no military experience. The Archbishop of York, Ealdred, whose word carries both spiritual and temporal weight, and dozens of lesser nobles whose collective decision will determine whether England faces civil war or foreign invasion. The debate has raged since dawn, though everyone knows the real choice was made when Harold commanded the only substantial military force within 3 days' march of London. Edgar's supporters speak of bloodlines and legitimacy, of the sacred nature of royal descent, but their words carry the hollow ring of men arguing for principle when pragmatism has already decided. You've heard the reports from your cousin who trades in Normandy. Duke William is already building ships, claiming Edward promised him the throne years ago. From the north comes word that Harald Hardrada of Norway, the greatest Viking warrior alive, also claims England through some convoluted connection to Knut. When your time comes to speak, you stand on the raised platform where testimonies are given, your voice carrying across the hall despite your trembling knees. You speak not of ancient bloodlines, but of present necessities. England needs a warrior king, you argue. A man who knows every fortification from Cornwall to Northumbria, who can call the feared to arms and lead them in the shield wall. Edgar is a boy, William is a foreigner, Hardrada is a Viking. Harold alone combines English birth, military prowess, and the administrative experience of 20 years governing Wessex. Your words are practical, uninspiring, but they resonate with men who fear this year will bring the greatest test since the Great Heathen Army. The formal vote proceeds by kingdom and rank. Wessex declares for Harold, unsurprisingly since he is their earl. Mercia wavers, their Earl Edwin, resentful of Godwinson power, but eventually acquiesces. Northumbria's representatives, arrived late through winter storms, seem resigned rather than enthusiastic. When Archbishop Ealdred calls for objections, the hall falls silent. Even Edgar Atheling, prompted by advisors, mumbles acceptance of the collective will. The decision is made. Harold Godwinson will be King of England. As you file from the hall toward the abbey for the immediate coronation, you pass a Norman merchant you recognise from Dover's markets. His eyes meet yours with an expression of pity or perhaps contempt. "You've chosen war," he says in accented English. You want to argue, to explain that you've chosen the best of bad options, but you know he's right. This morning you helped elect a king. By this evening, you'll begin preparing for invasions from north and south that will determine whether England remains English or becomes another province in someone else's. Empire. 3 kings, 3 battles. The year 1066 opened with an omen that froze blood across Europe. A comet, tail streaming like divine fire across the spring sky, visible even in daylight. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it appearing on April 24th, 4 days after Easter, remaining visible for 7 nights. In Rome, they called it a sign of coming judgment. In Normandy, Duke William's court poets proclaimed it heaven's announcement of his righteous claim. In England, Harold Godwinson's subjects saw their doom written in light across the darkness, and they were right. Harold spent the spring and summer of 1066 performing an administrative and military feat that deserves more recognition than history grants it. He maintained naval patrols along the southern coast for 4 months, an unprecedented achievement that prevented William's early crossing. He negotiated with his northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, whose loyalty remained questionable. He fortified potential landing sites, stockpiled supplies, and organised the most comprehensive defensive mobilisation in English history. By September, he had held the fired in arms for the maximum legal period and had to dismiss them for harvest, gambling that the approaching autumn storms would prevent invasion until spring. The gamble failed catastrophically. On September 20th, Harald Hardrada of Norway landed in the Humber with 300 ships and 15,000 warriors, the largest Viking army ever to assault England. With him came Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother, exiled and burning for revenge. They destroyed the Northern Earl's army at Fulford on September 20th, then occupied York, the ancient Northumbrian capital. Harold, learning of the invasion while in London, performed one of history's great forced marches, covering the 190 miles to York in 4 days, with his elite housecarls, gathering fired reinforcements as he moved. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, on September 25th, was the last great victory of Anglo-Saxon arms. Hardrada, confident after Fulford, had dispersed his army to forage, leaving their armour with the ships in the unseasonably warm weather. Harold's sudden appearance caught them completely unprepared. The battle became a slaughter, Hardrada falling with an arrow through his throat, Tostig cut down, refusing quarter. Of 300 Norwegian ships, only 24 carried survivors home. Harold had eliminated one existential threat to England in a single afternoon. But while Harold feasted in York, celebrating victory and reconciling with northern nobles, Norman scouts watched English weather from Dives-sur-Mer. On September 27th, the wind that had trapped William's invasion fleet for 6 weeks suddenly shifted southward. 700 ships, carrying 7,000 men, 2,000 horses, and prefabricated wooden castles crossed the Channel in a single night. They landed at Pevensey on September 28th, in the exact Roman fort where Saxon raiders had first established permanent presence 600 years before. History enjoys such symmetries. William's strategy was psychological as much as military. Rather than marching inland seeking battle, he established a fortified base at Hastings and systematically devastated the surrounding countryside. This was Harold's family homeland, where his father had built Godwinson power. Every burned farm, every slaughtered villager, was a personal insult demanding response. William knew Harold, exhausted from fighting Hardrada, depleted of his best troops, would have to attack rather than conduct a siege his reduced forces couldn't maintain. Harold reached London on October 6th, having covered another 190 miles in 5 days. Logic demanded he wait, gather fresh troops, let William extend himself inland. But London's merchants feared for their trade. His remaining nobles questioned his legitimacy after losing the southern coast, and every day of delay meant more English deaths in Sussex. On October 11th, Harold marched south with perhaps 7,000 men, many of them exhausted survivors of Stamford Bridge, others untrained peasants grabbed from harvest fields. Speed had won him victory in the north. He gambled it would work again. The armies met on October 14th, on a ridge 7 miles from Hastings, a position Harold chose for its defensive strength. The English shield wall, that formation that had protected Alfred at Edington and Athelstan at Brunanburh, stretched 600 yards along the ridgeline. For 6 hours, Norman cavalry charged and broke against it like waves against a cliff. William's archers, shooting uphill, saw their arrows caught on English shields or sailing harmlessly overhead. Breton infantry fled in genuine panic, pursued by English fieldmen who broke formation against Harold's orders. The battle turned on a tactical innovation and a strategic mistake. William ordered his archers to shoot at a higher trajectory, arrows falling like rain behind the shield wall. Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, fell among many others. Then William employed feigned retreat, his cavalry withdrawing in apparent disorder, drawing more English from their impregnable position. Each time they pursued, Norman cavalry wheeled and slaughtered them in the open. The shield wall, that symbol of Anglo-Saxon military tradition, began to thin and fragment. As afternoon faded toward evening, Harold still lived. His dragon banner still flew, and the ridge remained in English hands. Then, in history's cruelest moment, an arrow arcing high over the battlefield found the one gap in Harold's helmet, entering his eye and piercing his brain. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England fell among his housecarls, who died to a man rather than retreat, their bodies forming a wall around their dead lord, William, finding Harold's corpse so mutilated that identification required his mistress to recognise intimate body marks, granted him burial, but without marker or monument. The Norman conquest had begun. The arrow and the eye. Edith Swanneck moved through the carnage of Hastings Field as October 15th's dawn revealed the full horror of England's death. William's soldiers had stripped the dead of anything valuable, leaving naked corpses piled like cordwood, their faces already black with pooled blood, their wounds gaping obscenely in the pale morning light. She had come with 2 monks from Waltham Abbey, following William's grudging permission to find Harold's body for Christian burial, though the Duke insisted it be unmarked, uncommemorated, forgotten. She knew Harold's body, as only a lover could, bearing his children, though never his wife, sharing his bed for 20 years while politics demanded he marry elsewhere. Her name itself, Swan Neck, came from his pet name for her, and quote, praising the elegant curve of her throat that he would kiss each morning before rising to govern England. Now she searched for that throat among thousands, looking for the small scar below his left ear from a childhood fall, the birthmark on his shoulder that looked like a crescent moon, the particular pattern of golden hair across his chest that her fingers had traced countless nights. The monks retched and prayed in equal measure as they turned bodies, searching for their king among farmers and nobles made equal by death. Here lay a boy perhaps 15 years old, his first beard still soft, his hands clutching his spilled intestines. There sprawled a veteran warrior, his shield arm severed, his face set in the terrible grin of those who die in rage. Normans and English lay intertwined, their blood mixed so thoroughly that the ground had turned to crimson mud that sucked at Edith's shoes. She found him by elimination more than recognition. The housecarls had died in a circle, their bodies pointing inward like some horrible flower. and at its centre lay what had been the last English king. His face was destroyed, whether by the arrow that killed him or Norman mutilation afterward she couldn't tell. His royal mail had been stolen, his golden arm rings taken, even his finger removed to claim its ring. But there, on what remained of his chest, was the pattern she knew, and on his shoulder, the moon-shaped mark that had fascinated their children. As she cradled what remained of Harold's head, Edith allowed herself one sob, quickly suppressed. She had work to do, a king to bury, children to protect, an ending to witness. The monks wrapped Harold in their cloaks, carrying him like a sack of grain to avoid Norman notice. They buried him at Waltham Abbey that night, in ground he had consecrated without marker or ceremony, while Norman soldiers drank English ale in Winchester and London prepared its surrender. Edith lived another 20 years, never speaking publicly of Harold, raising their children as minor nobles who carefully never claimed royal blood. When she died, the priest who gave last rites reported that her final words were in the old tongue, the English that was already becoming archaic as Norman French dominated court and church. She said, "I am going to my lord now," and whether she meant Christ or Harold, the priest didn't ask. The harrowing of the north, the winter of 1069 to 1070, brought such devastation to northern England that a century later, the land still bore scars, entire districts marked in Domesday Book as waste, producing nothing, worth nothing, inhabited by none. William's systematic destruction of Yorkshire and surrounding shires was not war but extermination, not conquest but obliteration, designed to ensure that the North would never again support rebellion against Norman rule. The provocation had been real enough. Northern earls, encouraged by Danish invasion fleets and Scottish support, had risen repeatedly against Norman authority. York had changed hands 3 times. Norman garrisons massacred, William's own appointed earl killed at Durham. But the response exceeded any military necessity. This was punishment intended to echo through generations, to teach all of England that resistance meant not just death, but the death of everything that made life possible. William's armies moved through Yorkshire like a plague, burning not just houses, but barns filled with winter grain, not just killing livestock, but poisoning wells, not just cutting down rebels, but hunting peasants through winter forests like animals. Ordericus Vitalis, writing a generation later with Norman sympathy, still condemned it as a stain on William's soul, describing starving survivors eating dogs, cats, rats, and eventually each other. The Archbishop of York reported seeing bodies along roadsides, with grass in their mouths, having tried to survive on cattle feed before dying. Villages that had existed since before Roman times simply ceased. Their names disappeared from records, their fields returned to forest, their churches collapsed into moss-covered ruins that Victorian antiquarians would later find mysteriously romantic. Refugee columns fled south, bringing tales of Norman knights, amusing themselves by hanging entire families from single trees, seeing how many bodies oak branches could support before breaking. The demographic catastrophe was so complete that Norman and Flemish settlers had to be imported to repopulate districts where no English remained alive. But friend, this was the price of England's conquest. Not just political submission, but cultural annihilation in regions that resisted. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, maintaining its entries despite Norman domination, records these years with unusual emotion, breaking through its typically terse style. He destroyed the land and burned all the grain and killed the people and thus ruined it completely. The chronicler then adds, in a phrase that captures the totality of devastation, there was such hunger that men ate each other. By spring 1070, the north was pacified through depopulation. William could travel from York to Durham without seeing smoke from a single cooking fire. The harrying had succeeded in its immediate goal. Northern England would never rebel again. But it had also demonstrated that the Norman conquest was not merely a change of dynasty, but a transformation enforced through terror. The England that emerged from this winter would speak French in its courts, build castles rather than burhs, and remember the Anglo-Saxon past as a golden age forever lost to foreign swords. Echoes in the English tongue. Listen carefully to modern English, and you hear Anglo-Saxon ghosts whispering through centuries. Every day of the week carries their gods' names. Tuesday for Tyw the war god, Wednesday for Woden the wanderer, Thursday for Thunor the thunderer, Friday for Frege the beloved. The most fundamental words, those we learn as children and speak in extremity, remain Anglo-Saxon. Love, hate, heart, hand. Mother, father, child, death, life, earth, heaven, hell. Norman French gave English its vocabulary of power and administration, Latin its abstract concepts, but Anglo-Saxon provided the bedrock on which all else builds. Place names preserve memories that history forgot. Every ham remembers a homestead, every ton a settlement, every burg a fortified place. Birmingham, Nottingham, Southampton, Canterbury, Salisbury, Edinburgh, towns and cities whose names were spoken before the Norman conquest and continue being spoken long after anyone remembers what they mean. In these syllables, Anglo-Saxon England achieved its strangest victory. Conquered politically, it conquered linguistically, forcing Norman rulers to eventually speak the tongue of those they had defeated. The landscape itself remembers. Offa's Dyke still marks the Welsh border. Alfred's burhs became market towns that thrive today. Anglo-Saxon field boundaries, preserved through 1,000 years of ploughing, show from the air as crop marks visible only to archaeological flights. Their churches, rebuilt in stone by Normans, often stand on Saxon foundations, oriented by Saxon astronomy, serving parishes whose boundaries were walked by Saxon priests blessing Saxon fields. In quiet moments, when autumn mist rises from English rivers at dawn, when winter storms lash North Sea coasts, when summer light slants golden through oak forests, the Anglo-Saxon past feels present, not as history but as atmosphere, a way of being in landscape that predates and will outlast all political arrangements. They gave us more than words and walls. They gave us the dream of England, that impossible, indefinable idea that survives conquest, civil war, empire's rise and fall, remaining constant while everything else changes, as eternal and mortal as the language they left us, in which these very words remember them. As Saxon steel gave way to Norman stone, as English voices fell silent in the halls of power while French phrases filled Westminster's corridors, it might have seemed that the Anglo-Saxon contribution to history had ended, overwhelmed like Harold's housecarls by superior force and foreign ambition. Yet conquest, that apparently final historical verdict, proved merely another chapter in transformation. The Normans built their castles on Anglo-Saxon foundations, crowned their kings in Edward's Abbey, administered their realm through the shire system Alfred had created. Within 2 centuries, these French-speaking conquerors were writing English poetry, their descendants unable to speak the language their ancestors had imposed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle continued its entries until 1154, nearly a century after Hastings, maintained by English monks who understood that recording events meant preserving identity, that memory creates resistance more effectively than swords. Today, whenever an English speaker anywhere in the world says, "I love you," they use Anglo-Saxon words. When they count to 10, 7 of those numbers come from Anglo-Saxon. When they name the days or describe the weather, or tell their children bedtime stories about dragons and heroes, they unconsciously participate in traditions that began in the mead halls of Hengist, evolved in Alfred's Winchester, and survived William's harrying. The internet, that most modern of innovations, spreads Anglo-Saxon linguistic DNA to every corner of Earth and beyond, to space stations and Mars rovers that carry English words derived from farmers who crossed the North Sea in wooden boats, seeking land to plant barley and raise children. Perhaps this is the truest Anglo-Saxon legacy. Not the kingdoms that rose and fell, not the battles won and lost, but the demonstration that culture transcends conquest, that language outlasts empires, that what seems like ending often masks transformation. They arrived as scattered warbands, fleeing poverty and overcrowding. They became the creators of English literature, English law, English identity itself. They remind us that civilization is not preserved in stone and steel, but in the words we speak, the stories we tell, the stubborn insistence that meaning matters more than power. I'm thankful you've joined me in visiting these distant memories. Rest well beneath the starlit skies of ancient nights.